Fifth row, empty. The projection booth above the Orion Theater smells of hot metal and old oil. The odor never leaves the walls. It settles into the wood like a second skin. Henry has worked here long enough to carry it home in his clothes, in his hair, in the quiet between his breaths. Outside, the town in Ohio folds into itself. The main street ends at a row of boarded auto shops, their windows painted over with a white that has already begun to peel. Evening is thick and gray, the kind that makes the sky indistinguishable from the asphalt. Nothing shines. Even the wind seems tired. Inside the booth, the projector runs. Its beam cuts through the darkness with mechanical faithfulness. Dust floats in the column of light, turning slowly, as if unsure whether to fall or remain suspended. They are the only audience tonight. The seats below are empty. Their red velvet backs are faded to a color without a name. Henry stands over the machine and checks the sprockets of the film. He has done this thousands of times. Once, his hands moved without thought. Now his fingers tremble slightly. A discreet betrayal. He pretends not to notice. The coffee in a paper cup beside him has grown cold. A thin skin has formed on its surface, delicate and stubborn. The film begins to tremble into motion. Click, click, click. The sound is steady, not loud, not urgent. It measures something that no clock records. Henry does not look at the screen. He knows every frame. The lovers will quarrel, then forgive each other in the rain. The laughter will rise and fall on cue. Their certainty feels almost indecent. He descends the narrow staircase and enters the auditorium. The screen flickers with a melodrama from another decade. Faces larger than life lean into embraces that no one witnesses. Henry sits in the fifth row. The velvet beneath his palm is worn thin, but still soft. It yields without resistance. He feels a quiet kinship with it. Both have endured by doing the same thing over and over again. He watches for a moment. The actors laugh brightly. Their joy is preserved in light, immune to rust. Henry understands then that he is not the man showing the film. He is something else, an extra, who remained after the story ended. The building breathes around him with the slow patience of old brick. In the middle of a scene, the projector shudders. The light falters. There is a brief yellow stain across the screen, as if the sun had pressed its thumb there. Then the lamp burns out. Darkness settles without drama. Henry does not rise. The spare bulb rests on a shelf above the booth. He knows exactly where it is. He stays seated. In the silence, the only sound is the soft ticking of cooling metal overhead. It is not a violent end. It is closer to the extinguishing of a cigarette, a small red eye closing. He waits until the dark feels complete. Then he stands and walks outside. He does not lock the door. There is nothing inside that requires protection. The street lamp across the road flickers with a rhythm, not unlike the projector's old pulse. Henry lights a cigarette and inhales the cold, damp air. Smoke drifts upward and dissolves into the night. A truck passes in the distance, its headlights sweeping briefly across the empty street. For a moment, the theater facade glows again and returns to shadow. Henry remains still. There is no next screening. Only this quiet, where machines endure longer than men, and where even the dust seems prepared to outlive him. Morning comes without announcement. It seeps through the cracked window of the projection booth and settles on the silent machine like a pale verdict. The projector stands intact, heavy and patient. In daylight, it looks less heroic, more like a tool abandoned mid-task. Henry returns with the same key he has used for 30 years. The lock resists out of habit, not defiance. Inside, the air is colder. Without the lamp's heat, the booth smells only of metal and stale tobacco. He runs his hand along the projector's casing. The surface is cool, almost tender. There are scratches where his wedding ring once struck it in moments of distraction. The ring is gone now. The scratches remain. Downstairs, The seats wait in disciplined rows. Dust has settled overnight with quiet efficiency. It covers the armrests and the narrow aisle like a thin snowfall that no one will disturb. Henry walks between them, his steps measured, as if he might wake something fragile. On the screen, frozen in absence, there is nothing, just a rectangle of dull gray. He remembers when Saturday nights meant lines outside the door, teenagers laughing too loudly, couples pretending not to be seen. The building once inhaled voices and exhaled warmth. Now it holds its breath. Henry climbs back to the booth and looks at the spare lamp on the shelf. It is wrapped in paper, untouched, full of promise that no one has asked it to fulfill. He takes it in his hands. It is lighter than he expected. For a long moment, he considers the ritual unscrewing the old housing, fitting the new bulb, hearing the machine awaken again with obedient certainty. The projector would run. The film would flicker. The dust would dance. But for whom? He places the lamp back on the shelf, not out of bitterness, not out of fatigue, simply because the machine has already outlived its audience. To revive it would be to insist on a conversation with an empty room. Outside, a delivery truck rolls past without slowing. The driver does not glance at the marquee, where faded letters still promise last month's show. The town has shifted its gaze elsewhere toward brighter screens, smaller and more immediate. Henry stands in the booth and listens to the silence. It is not hostile. It does not accuse him. It only confirms what he has known for some time, that endurance is not the same as necessity. He switches off the main power. The click is small, almost polite. In that moment, the theater ceases not with collapse, but with agreement. The projector remains. The dust remains. The seats remain in orderly expectation. Henry understands that survival belongs to objects. Withdrawal belongs to men. He closes the booth door behind him, leaving the machine in its patient dark. By the third evening, the theater has already begun to forget itself. Henry sits on the edge of the stage, his legs hanging above the first row. The curtain is half drawn, heavy and tired, its red turned brown by years of light that no longer comes. The building makes small sounds in the cooling air wood adjusting, pipes settling, the faint whisper of something giving up its shape. He has not replaced the lamp. In the lobby, the glass case still displays photographs from premieres that no one remembers. Faces frozen in excitement, women in dresses too bright for this town, men with hair combed back in defiance of wind and time. The paper has yellowed. The smiles have not. Henry studies them as if they might accuse him of negligence. They do not. They are indifferent, preserved in chemical certainty. He envies them their permanence. He walks behind the concession counter. The popcorn machine stands clean and hollow. He runs his finger along its rim and finds only a fine trace of dust. Once, this place smelled of butter and impatience. Now it smells of paper and forgotten sugar. A single envelope rests near the register. He noticed it that morning, but did not open it. He knows what it contains. Notices always arrive folded in the same bureaucratic calm. He unfolds it now. The words are simple. The building has been sold. Renovation will begin in 2 weeks. The theater will become something efficient storage, perhaps. Or offices, something that does not require laughter. Henry reads the letter twice, not because he needs clarity, but because repetition has always been his discipline. Upstairs, the projector waits in its dark. It does not know it has been replaced. Machines do not experience displacement. They are either used or not. There is no humiliation in their stillness. Henry returns to the auditorium and sits again in the 5th row. The stage before him is empty. He imagines the beam of light crossing the room, dust igniting briefly in its path. He can almost hear the click of the film advancing. He closes his eyes. For a moment, he allows the illusion. The crowd murmuring, coats brushing against seats, a cough from the back row. The anticipation before the first frame appears. It was never about the story. It was about the shared darkness. When he opens his eyes, nothing has changed. He does not feel anger toward the town. Towns move on without ceremony. They trade one need for another. It is their nature to forget what once gathered them. Henry remains seated until the light outside fades completely. Then he rises slowly, as if concluding a performance no one attended. At the door, he pauses and looks back into the black auditorium. The seats stand in orderly silence, patient as soldiers dismissed from a war that ended without victory. He turns the key in the lock this time. The sound is final, but not cruel. On the sidewalk, the street lamp flickers again, uncertain yet persistent. Henry lights a cigarette and watches the smoke dissolve into the cooling night. Somewhere far off, a train passes, its low horn stretching across the fields beyond town. He does not look back a second time. The projector will remain upstairs, intact, durable, unnecessary. And Henry, walking slowly down the empty street, understands that disappearance rarely arrives with drama. More often, it is simply the absence of the next showing. The following week, Henry begins to empty the booth. There is no ceremony to it. He brings a cardboard box from home, one that once carried winter clothes. It is too large for the small objects he intends to keep, but he prefers excess space to tightness. Tightness suggests urgency. The projector remains bolted to its base. It is not his to take. It never was. He starts with the splicing tools. The small metal cutter. The tape, yellowed at the edges. A grease pencil worn almost to its last inch. Each object carries the memory of precise hands and interrupted frames. He places them carefully into the box, as if they might bruise. The booth window is cloudy from years of breath and heat. Through it, he can see the blank screen below. For a moment, he imagines turning the machine on one final time. Not for an audience, only to watch the beam move across the dust again. He does not. Instead, he wipes the console with a rag he keeps folded in his coat pocket. The surface shines faintly, revealing scratches that form their own quiet history. His movements are methodical. They resemble care, though there is no one left to witness it. Downstairs, two men in reflective jackets measure the lobby. Their voices are brisk and professional. They speak of square footage and ventilation, of dividing walls and improved lighting. One of them laughs at something unrelated to the building. Henry listens from the staircase. He feels no resentment. The theater is already adjusting to new intentions. The walls do not resist. They never have. In the auditorium, the seats have begun to loosen. A few screws lie scattered in the aisle, small and metallic like forgotten coins. One chair leans slightly forward, as if trying to hear something that will not return. Henry walks to the fifth row and runs his hand across the armrest where he once sat during the blackout. The fabric is thinner there now, polished by years of elbows and waiting. He remembers the moment the lamp burned out. The yellow stain, the immediate dark. It had felt complete, almost merciful. No applause, no protest. He carries the box to the exit and pauses at the threshold. The afternoon light is sharper than the interior gloom. It exposes everything without sentiment. He sets the box in the trunk of his car and stands for a while beside the open door. The Orion sign above him creaks in the wind. A few letters are missing. The name no longer reads clearly. It has begun to stutter. A woman walks past with a grocery bag and does not look up. Henry closes the trunk. The sound echoes briefly against the facade. It is the loudest noise he has made all day. He does not return inside. The projector remains upstairs, solid and patient, awaiting a command that will never come. The building will be stripped of velvet and memory. It will become something useful again. Henry lights a cigarette and watches the smoke thin in the sunlight. He understands now that usefulness is a season. Objects may survive it. Men rarely do. He gets into his car and drives away without haste. Behind him, the theater stands as it always has, upright, durable, and already forgetting the weight of his hands. The house is quieter than the theater ever was. Henry places the cardboard box on the kitchen table and does not open it. The room smells faintly of detergent and old wood. The clock above the sink ticks with exaggerated confidence, as if proud to be necessary. He sits down without removing his coat. For years, his evenings were measured by reels 20 minutes, then a changeover. 2 hours, then another showing. Now time stretches without divisions. It does not demand attention. It simply passes. Outside, the town continues in modest rhythms. A dog barks once and then reconsiders. A car door closes. Somewhere, a television laughs behind thin walls. The sounds reach him softened, already distant. Henry finally opens the box. The splicer lies on top, cold and precise. He picks it up and turns it in his hands. It is heavier than it appears, built to correct mistakes with clean edges. He remembers the feel of film between his fingers, the delicate tension, the risk of tearing something that could not be replaced. He sets the tool down gently. From the window, he can see the faint outline of the Orion sign at the end of the street. In the dark, it resembles a broken constellation. One letter flickers once and then gives up entirely. He does not feel sadness. Sadness implies resistance. What he feels is closer to alignment, as if his pace has finally matched the town's slow retreat. He rises and steps outside. The night air is cool, carrying a trace of damp soil. He lights a cigarette and inhales without hurry. Smoke gathers around his face before dissolving into the dark, indistinguishable from breath. Across town, the theater's windows are already black. No beam escapes them. No dust dances in artificial light. The building stands in calm obscurity, like a machine disconnected from its source. Henry understands now that the projector was never the center of his life. It was simply a device that required him. And in being required, he felt anchored. He exhales and watches the smoke vanish. There will be no next shift, no lamp to replace, no audience to imagine. Only mornings that arrive without announcement and evenings that fold quietly into themselves. He finishes the cigarette and crushes it beneath his shoe. For a moment, he stands completely still, neither waiting nor remembering. The town breathes around him in small, ordinary sounds. Somewhere far off, a truck moves along the highway, unseen. Henry turns back toward the house. Inside, the box remains on the table. The tools will rust more slowly than he will. The projector will endure in storage or scrap. The seats will be dismantled, their velvet stripped and repurposed. And he, like the beam that once crossed the dust-filled air, will leave no trace, but a brief illumination noticed by no one, necessary for a time, and then quietly gone. Silent mechanisms. By late afternoon, the air above the Blue Star Motel had thickened into something metallic and sour, as if the sky itself had rusted and begun to sweat. Rain threatened without conviction. Ana pushed her metal cart across the coarse concrete, the wheels cracking against the walls like distant gunshots in an abandoned chapel. Her palms smelled of cheap chlorine and old tobacco. The scent no longer washed off. It had settled into her skin, the way fatigue settles into bone. Room 9 waited with its curtains drawn. She unlocked the door and stood still before entering, listening. Motel silence was never whole. It hummed in fragments, a refrigerator's tired murmur, the faint hiss of tires passing on the highway. Inside, the air held the stale trace of someone else's perfume. A narrow blade of dusty light cut through the dimness like an accusation. Kneeling to change the sheets, she saw it beneath the bed. A plastic doll, one leg twisted unnaturally. She reached for it. It was heavier than it looked. One eye remained half open, half closed, as if undecided whether to witness or forgive. Ana pressed her thumb against the lid, trying to force it awake. A small plastic click answered her, final and useless. In the mottled mirror, she studied herself holding the toy. Black stains bloomed in the glass corners like old bruises. For a moment, she imagined the family who had stayed here. A woman painting her lips in haste. A man waiting by the door with keys in hand. They did not look at each other. They looked at clocks. She remembered the sound at dawn. A car door shutting, dry and absolute. No voices, no pleading. The worst departures she knew made no noise at all. She did not place the doll on the dresser with the forgotten chargers and room keys. Instead, Ana slipped it into the deep pocket of her apron. The fabric bulged awkwardly, the crooked leg pressing against her hip like a quiet reminder. It was not tenderness that moved her. It was something closer to defiance, a small refusal to let the room erase itself completely. She poured herself a cup of coffee from the thermos she carried on the cart. It had gone cold hours ago, bitter, metallic, almost burnt. She sat on the low chair beside the trash bag and drank it anyway. The doll rested on her knees now. Outside the window, the world stretched wide and indifferent. But here, in room 9, time had stalled for a breath. Objects remained. People did not. When she finished the bed, the new sheets lay smooth and starched, smelling of detergent and sterile loneliness. She pulled the curtains apart. Evening had begun its slow descent. On the horizon, the first truck headlights appeared, drifting along the highway like patient insects. The air shifted, cooler now, and a draft swept dust across the carpet in a thin, restless spiral. Ana stepped out onto the motel gallery. The railing was damp and cold beneath her palms. She lit a cigarette and leaned forward, watching the road that led away from the cornfields. Smoke rose and thinned into the coming dark. She felt the weight in her pocket. Not comfort, not regret, just proof. She was still here. The shift was over. The night, like everything else, would pass without asking her anything at all. Night settled without ceremony. The sky bruised into purple and then into something deeper, a color that had no name and no promise. The motel lights flickered on one by one, pale halos trembling against the gathering dark. Ana remained on the gallery a moment longer, cigarette burning down to the filter, the ember the only decisive thing in sight. Below, the parking lot lay half empty. A pickup truck idled near the ice machine, its engine coughing softly as if unsure whether to stay or leave. The soda machine hummed. Somewhere a door opened, then closed again with care. People moved through their lives here like shadows crossing a wall, briefly visible, never touching. She crushed the cigarette beneath her shoe and felt the doll's rigid legs shift against her side. The pressure was small but persistent. It made her aware of her own body, the stiffness in her shoulders, the dull ache in her knees from years of kneeling beside other people's beds. Wear accumulates quietly. It does not announce itself. It simply remains. Inside the service closet, she hung her apron on its hook. For a second she hesitated, then removed the doll and placed it back into the pocket. Not lost property, not trash. Something unrecorded. She switched off the light and stepped into the corridor. The motel breathed around her, indifferent and steady. Dawn was still hours away, but she felt its approach, not as hope, not as fear, only as continuation. The night clerk nodded to her without lifting his eyes from the small television balanced on the counter. The screen flickered blue against his face, washing him of expression. Ana signed the clipboard with a pen that scratched more than it wrote. Names accumulated there like dust, signatures that proved someone had existed for a shift, for a night, for a narrow slice of time no one would revisit. Outside, the air had cooled enough to sting. She walked the length of the gallery once more, as if inspecting something that did not belong to her. The rooms were sealed behind identical doors. Behind each, a different arrangement of fatigue and silence. Behind each, objects waiting to outlive the hands that touched them. A truck pulled into the lot, headlights sweeping briefly across her body. For a second she was illuminated. Apron, tired shoes, the faint outline at her hip. Then the light moved on. The engine cut. A door opened, closed. The ritual began again, mechanical and unremarkable. Aina leaned against the railing and watched the man carry a single suitcase toward the office. He did not look up. He did not see her. She understood this without resentment. People rarely see what stands still. They register movement, urgency, departure. Stillness belongs to the background. When she finally turned toward the stairs, she felt the doll pressing into her side like a quiet pulse. Not comfort, not attachment. A reminder that something had been left behind, and that she, for once, had chosen not to leave it. The sky above the cornfields darkened completely. No stars yet, just the weight of waiting, stretching toward a dawn that would arrive whether anyone wished for it or not. Past midnight, the motel settled into its truest shape, not as a place, but as a pause. The office light burned alone. The vending machine flickered with a tired insistence. Aina had not gone home. She rarely hurried toward an empty room that smelled of detergent and nothing else. She sat at the far end of the gallery, where the concrete held the day's warmth a little longer. The doll lay in her lap. In the thin glow from the corridor bulb, its damaged eye seemed almost reflective, catching fragments of light and returning them without meaning. She traced the crack along its plastic cheek with her thumb. It felt smooth, indifferent to the story it might once have carried. Across the highway, a freight train moved slowly through the dark. Its metal wheels ground against the rails with patient resignation. No whistle, no announcement. Just movement through distance. She imagined the family already far away, driving toward some other temporary address. Perhaps they would notice the doll missing. Perhaps they would not. Aina leaned back and closed her eyes for a moment. The world did not shift. The trucks kept moving. The neon sign above the office buzzed faintly, one letter struggling to stay lit. She felt the weight against her thighs and understood that the object meant nothing and everything at once. Not a rescue. Not redemption. Only proof that something could remain, even if it remained for the wrong reasons. When she opened her eyes, the sky had lightened by a shade so slight it was almost imaginary. Dawn approached without drama. She stood, slipped the doll back into her pocket, and walked toward the service door. Another shift would begin soon. People would arrive and leave, leaving nothing but sheets to fold and air to replace. She did not expect more. She did not require it. She moved forward because forward was the only direction that did not ask questions. Before dawn, the sky thinned into a colorless gray that erased the horizon. The cornfields beyond the highway lost their edges, becoming a single flat breadth of land. Aina unlocked the service door and stepped back inside. The corridor smelled faintly of detergent and something metallic, like coins held too long in a closed fist. She prepared the cart again. Fresh towels folded with mechanical precision. Small bottles of shampoo aligned like obedient soldiers. The ritual did not require thought. It required repetition. Her body understood this better than her mind ever had. Repetition was safer than memory. As she moved toward room 10, she felt the doll shift in her pocket. The weight was modest, but it altered her balance by a fraction. Enough to notice. Enough to remind her that she had interrupted the usual order of things. Lost items were meant to be cataloged, labeled, forgotten. She had chosen otherwise. In the office, the night clerk yawned and handed over the new key list without comment. Another name had been added. Another temporary inhabitant. Aina studied the number briefly, then looked away. She knew how this would unfold. A suitcase, a shower, a night, departure. The rooms would absorb their presence and then return to neutrality. Outside, the first truck of the morning rolled past, its headlights pale in the growing light. Aina paused at the end of the corridor. For a second, she considered removing the doll and placing it somewhere visible, on a windowsill, on the reception desk, anywhere it could be reclaimed by chance. Instead, she tightened her grip on the cart and continued forward. Dawn did not promise change. It simply confirmed endurance. The motel would fill and empty again. People would pass through one another without leaving marks. Only objects would remain to testify, silent and patient. Anna walked into the new day, carrying something she did not need, and for the first time in years, the burden felt almost deliberate. Morning arrived without color. The sun rose behind a veil of thin cloud, turning the motel facade into a pale, indifferent surface. The Blue Star sign flickered once and surrendered to daylight. Anna finished room 10 in silence. A wet towel on the floor, a ring of toothpaste in the sink, evidence of presence already fading. In the laundry room, machines churned with a low, resigned rhythm. Sheets revolved in circles, erasing the imprint of bodies that had pressed against them hours before. Anna stood watching the glass door of the washer, her reflection passing again and again over the tumbling fabric. She thought of the doll in her pocket, a thing that had escaped rotation. When her shift ended, she stepped outside once more. The highway shimmered faintly in the growing heat. Cars moved steadily, purposeful and unaware. She leaned against the railing as she had the night before, but the air felt different now, thinner, less forgiving. She took the doll from her pocket and held it in both hands. In daylight, its damage was clearer. Scratches along the plastic scalp, the eye still stuck between sleep and wakefulness. She did not try to fix it this time. Some mechanisms are not meant to reopen. For a moment, she considered leaving it on the railing, exposed to sun and chance. Instead, she placed it gently into her canvas bag, not as a keepsake, not as consolation, simply as continuation. Across the fields, a truck horn sounded, brief, distant. Anna descended the stairs and walked toward the bus stop at the edge of the lot. The motel behind her resumed its quiet function. People would arrive. People would leave. Rooms would reset. She did not look back. The day stretched ahead, unpromising and intact. She felt the familiar weight at her side and understood that nothing essential had changed. Yet something small had shifted. Not hope, not rebellion, but a private adjustment in the balance of absence. She moved forward through the thinning morning, carrying what had been left behind, and the world did not notice. The bus stop stood at the edge of the service road, a metal bench bolted into cracked pavement. Anna sat with her canvas bag resting against her feet. The morning traffic moved in disciplined streams, each vehicle certain of its direction. She watched them pass as if observing a current she had once meant to enter. A man in a work jacket joined her without greeting. He smelled faintly of gasoline and sleep. They sat side by side, not touching, not speaking. The silence between them was not hostile. It was structural. People often mistook proximity for connection. Anna had long ago stopped making that mistake. When the bus arrived, its doors opened with a sigh. Inside, the seats were lined in faded fabric, patterned with shapes that no longer resembled anything real. She chose a place by the window. The city slid by in muted colors. Warehouses, billboards, a closed diner with its chairs stacked upside down. She reached into her bag and touched the doll without looking at it. The plastic felt cool, unaffected by the motion of the bus. Around her, passengers stared at their phones or at nothing at all. Faces reflected in the glass, layered over one another, temporary and interchangeable. At a red light, the bus halted beside a playground enclosed by chain-link fencing. The swings hung still. No children yet. Anna imagined placing the doll on one of the empty seats, letting it wait for hands that might claim it. The thought passed without insistence. Some objects are not meant to return. They are meant to migrate. The light changed. The bus moved again. Anna leaned her head against the window and closed her eyes briefly. The day would unfold in its usual sequence: groceries, a narrow kitchen, evening. She felt the steady weight in her bag and accepted it as one accepts a scar. Not as wound, not as story, but as fact. The world advanced around her, untouched. She remained within it, carrying what did not belong, and the motion continued. Her apartment building stood 3 blocks from the final stop, a narrow structure pressed between a discount pharmacy and a shuttered tailor shop. The hallway smelled of boiled cabbage and old paint. Aina climbed the stairs slowly, counting them without meaning to. Repetition calmed the mind. It reduced life to numbers and surfaces. Inside, the room greeted her with the same stillness she had left the day before. A small table, a narrow bed, curtains the color of diluted milk. She placed the canvas bag on the chair and did not turn on the light. Morning filtered through the window in a thin, undecided glow. She removed the doll and set it on the table. In this space, it looked almost ceremonial, as if waiting to be addressed. The damaged eye caught the pale light and held it without expression. Aina poured herself a glass of water and sat opposite it. They regarded one another in silence. On the wall hung a calendar from 2 years ago. She had never replaced it. The dates meant little. Days followed one another with mechanical obedience. She reached across the table and adjusted the doll's twisted leg so it rested more evenly. The gesture was practical, not tender. From the street below came the distant grind of a delivery truck. Life continuing, distributing goods to hands she would never see. Aina leaned back in her chair. The apartment did not feel fuller with the toy inside it. It did not feel emptier either. It simply contained one more object that would outlast intention. She stood, carried the doll to the shelf above the sink, and placed it there facing the room. Not hidden, not displayed, present. Then she lay down on the bed without undressing. The ceiling above her was cracked in thin lines that resembled maps of territories she would never enter. She closed her eyes. The day outside advanced without consultation. Inside, nothing demanded explanation. She woke in the late afternoon to the sound of pipes knocking somewhere in the walls. For a moment, she did not remember where she was. Then the ceiling came back into focus, its thin fractures crossing like untraveled roads. The light in the room had shifted, heavier now, more decisive. The doll remained on the shelf above the sink. It had not moved. Objects rarely do. They wait with a patience that makes human urgency seem theatrical. Aina rose, washed her face in cold water, and avoided looking at the mirror for longer than necessary. The day had advanced without her, as it always did. She made a small meal, bread, cheese, nothing that required flame. She ate standing up. Across the room, the doll's half-open eye caught the fading light again. It did not accuse. It did not console. It simply occupied space. As evening approached, she changed into her work clothes. The fabric felt familiar against her skin, like a uniform for a battle that required no courage, only attendance. Before leaving, she paused by the shelf. For a second, she considered taking the doll back with her, returning it to the motel, restoring the order she had disturbed. Instead, she left it where it was. Outside, the sky darkened over the pharmacy sign and the empty tailor shop window. Aina locked the door and descended the stairs. The bus would arrive soon. Another shift would begin. People would pass through one another again, unmarked and unremembered. Behind her, in the quiet apartment, the doll faced the empty room, bearing silent witness to a life that, like all others, continued without promise. Aina walked toward the stop, hands in her pockets, the evening air cooling around her. She felt no revelation, no resolve, only endurance. The last stop before dawn was not a destination. It was a habit, and she had learned, without complaint, how to remain. That night, the air above the motel felt thinner. as if something had already been taken from it. The blue star sign hummed unevenly. One letter flickered, then steadied, then flickered again. Aina pushed her cart along the gallery, the wheels striking the concrete with the same hollow report. The sound no longer startled her. It marked time. Room 14 had been vacated early. The key lay on the counter without comment. Inside, the bed was untouched, the sink dry. A suitcase-shaped absence pressed into the carpet near the door, already relaxing back into flatness. She stood in the doorway longer than necessary. An unused room felt different, not cleaner, not quieter, just incomplete. As she wiped the desk, she noticed a faint square of lighter dust where a photograph must have stood. The frame was gone. Only its outline remained, pale against the darker surface. Aina ran her fingers over it. The shape dissolved beneath her touch. Even absence fades. From outside came the brief slam of a car door. Metal against metal. She paused, listening. No voices followed. No argument. Just the engine turning over and receding toward the highway. She did not move to the window. She did not need to see. She understood the geometry of departure. When she finished, she stepped back into the corridor. The night clerk nodded once. A new guest had already signed in. The cycle did not hesitate. Aina felt the familiar steadiness settle over her. Not comfort, not despair. A balance maintained through repetition. For a moment, she imagined the doll on the shelf in her apartment, facing an empty room. An object keeping vigil over nothing. She found the image neither tragic nor tender. It simply existed. She pushed the cart forward again. The motel absorbed another night. People would arrive before dawn, carrying bags, carrying fatigue, carrying words they would not use. They would leave traces too faint to measure. And the rooms would wait, patient and unoffended, ready to begin again. Lost sentence. Rain over the Ohio plains did not fall so much as erase. It pressed the world into a single gray surface, smoothing fields, roofs, and distant silos into one exhausted tone. In the gas station parking lot, oil-slick puddles held the trembling reflection of a neon sign that blinked without conviction. Inside, the air smelled of old coffee, chlorine, and rubber warmed too many times. Havis sat on a plastic chair near the radiator. His jacket was heavy with rain, his boots marking dull crescents across the polished tiles. On his knees lay a book rescued from a library dumpster, its corners bent, its pages yellowed and soft as tired skin. His fingers, once trained to square stacks of paper in a printing press, still searched automatically for the edge of a page. They moved with the memory of machinery, though the machines had long ago fallen silent. He read slowly, lips shaping the words of a cheap romance novel, as if they required careful assembly. The story did not matter. The rhythm did. It was enough that sentences followed one another in obedient lines. But when he reached the end, the rhythm broke. The final page had been torn out. What remained was a jagged white margin, sharp and unfinished, like a thought interrupted by sleep. Behind the counter, Miller poured coffee into a plastic cup. The stream was steady, almost consoling. He did not look at Havis. He watched the empty road through the window, as though waiting for something that had already decided not to come. Havis touched the torn edge again and again. The sentence ended in mid-breath. No explanation, no forgiveness, just a clean absence where meaning should have been. For a moment, he considered anger, but it did not arrive. Instead, there was recognition. Most of his own conversations had stopped the same way doors, closing before words could finish arranging themselves. Decisions made somewhere else. He held the book with both hands, feeling its modest weight. It was not disappointment he felt, but agreement. Life, like this discarded novel, rarely offered conclusions. There was only the reading, until the light went out. The rain did not stop. It merely thinned, as if reconsidering its own persistence. Outside, The highway remained empty, a long gray sentence stretching beyond grammar. Inside the station, the fluorescent lights hummed with a tired insistence. Havis had not moved far. He had only shifted the book slightly closer to the radiator, as the warmth might coax the final page back into existence. He began again from the previous chapter. Not to recover the ending, he already knew that was impossible, but to study the approach. His lips shaped the words silently. A woman waiting by a window. A man arriving too late. Cheap emotions printed in cheaper ink. Yet beneath the predictability, there was a fragile structure, like scaffolding around a building never finished. Havis traced each paragraph with his finger, attentive to the cadence, the small mechanical faith that the next line would follow. When he reached the torn edge once more, he stopped. The white absence did not accuse him. It simply existed. He pressed his thumb against it, feeling the rough fibers where the page had been ripped away. In the printing house, torn paper had meant waste and error to be swept aside. Here, it felt deliberate, almost honest. The story had advanced as far as it could, then admitted defeat. Miller cleared his throat behind the counter. The radio murmured about distant cities, about elections and storms moving east. Words floated through the room, detached from consequence. Havis glanced up, as if tempted to ask whether Miller believed in endings. But the question dissolved before it formed. Men like them did not exchange such things. They traded silence for warmth and let the rest remain unspoken. Havis closed the book halfway, not fully, leaving it ajar like a door that might yet open. He understood now that the missing fragment was not an interruption, but a mirror. What unsettled him was not the absence of resolution, but the clarity it brought. The characters would remain suspended forever on that threshold, and perhaps that was kinder than forcing them toward a conclusion they did not deserve. The hour grew later without ceremony. One of the fluorescent tubes flickered, then steadied, as if reconsidering extinction. The rain had settled into a patient drizzle that polished the asphalt into a dull mirror. Havis lifted his eyes from the book and watched the reflection of the neon sign tremble in the puddles. It looked less like light and more like a memory of light. Miller leaned against the counter, his back curved in the shape of long shifts. He stared at the road with the expression of a man who has learned that nothing arrives simply because it is awaited. The radio murmured about distant accidents, about markets rising and falling, about weather systems that would never reach this particular stretch of Ohio. Havis studied Miller's profile and understood that asking about endings would be like asking about God possible, but without practical result. He lowered his gaze to the torn page again. The white gap did not seem violent anymore. It felt inevitable. He thought of the press room where machines once thundered and paper ran through rollers in obedient streams. There had always been a final cut, a last stack, a whistle signaling the shift's end. Even then, the work had not truly concluded. It had simply paused until the next batch. Yet his own life had not paused. It had thinned, like ink diluted too many times. A memory surfaced, an argument unfinished, a door closing before the apology could form. He could no longer recall the exact words, only the sensation of interruption. The book's missing page carried the same texture. He realized with a quiet certainty that the absence was not a flaw, but a precise description. Most decisive moments dissolve before they are recognized. Meaning rarely announces itself with punctuation. Havis rested both hands on the book, palms flat, as if to steady something fragile. He felt neither anger nor regret, only a calm acknowledgement that the world did not owe him coherence. Outside, a car's headlights appeared briefly on the horizon, then veered off onto a side road, leaving the highway empty again. The light had approached and departed without narrative. And that, he understood, was the most faithful ending of all. The station had grown quieter, as if even the walls were tired of holding sound. One of the neon letters outside surrendered with a faint metallic click, and the reflection in the puddles lost a fragment of its glow. Havis slipped his hand into his pocket and drew out the stub of a pencil. It was worn down to a blunt remnant, the wood chipped, the graphite dulled by years of being carried without purpose. He turned the book open again to the torn edge. For a moment he considered pressing the pencil to the paper, forcing a conclusion into the fibers. But that would have been too decisive, too violent. The book had already accepted its incompleteness. Instead, he lifted his hand and hovered it just above the white gap. Slowly, almost ceremoniously, he traced invisible lines in the air, as if the words existed in a thinner dimension only he could see. In his imagined ending, no one reconciled and no one perished. The lovers did not collapse into each other's arms, nor did they suffer dramatically. They simply turned away at a crossroads made ordinary by rain. Each walked in a separate direction without accusation. The sky remained overcast. There was no lesson, no redemption, only movement. It was the kind of ending that did not disturb the night. Miller shifted behind the counter, adjusting the radio's volume. A faint melody drifted through the room, then dissolved into static. He did not ask what Havis was doing. From a distance, it might have looked like nothing at all. A man resting his hand above a book. And in a way, it was nothing. A private correction of a public absence. When Havis finished tracing the unseen words, he lowered his hand and closed the book carefully. The ending existed now, but only in him. It required no ink, no approval. He slipped the pencil back into his pocket. The act had not changed the world, nor repaired anything torn. Yet it had granted him a narrow corridor of authorship, a quiet space where the sentence did not break unless he allowed it to. Near midnight, Miller reached up and switched off one of the remaining neon strips. The room surrendered a degree of brightness without protest. Shadows thickened along the shelves of motor oil and windshield fluid, gathering in the corners like patient witnesses. The radiator ticked softly, adjusting to the colder air that pressed against the glass doors. Havis stood. The movement was unremarkable, almost cautious, as though he were careful not to disturb the balance of the place. He slid the book beneath his jacket, close to his chest, feeling the dry rasp of its pages against his shirt. For a moment he remained there, upright and silent, as if waiting for a signal that would not come. Miller did not look at him. He wiped the counter in slow, habitual strokes, preserving the order of things that required no explanation. The door opened with a long metallic groan. Damp air entered, carrying the smell of wet asphalt and distant soil. Outside, the rain had softened into a fine mist that clung to the streetlights. A pair of headlights approached from the far end of the highway, briefly illuminating the station's faded sign before continuing past without slowing. The light swept over Havis, then withdrew, leaving him unremarkable again. He stepped onto the pavement. The puddles shifted under his boots, distorting the broken neon into wavering lines. He paused only to light his last cigarette. The flame flared, fragile but defiant, then settled into a steady ember. He inhaled deeply, as though committing the night to memory, though he knew it would resemble every other night that had preceded it. There was no conclusion waiting beyond the edge of the parking lot, only the road stretching forward, damp and indifferent. Havis exhaled, watching the smoke dissolve into the mist. Then he began to walk, not toward resolution, not toward redemption, only along the narrow strip of asphalt that remained visible. The story did not end. It merely continued quietly until the light thinned to ash. What still obeys? The warehouse lobby smells of damp concrete and old paint, warmed too many times by artificial light. Above, a fluorescent tube flickers with a tired persistence, casting a yellowish haze that never quite becomes darkness. Beyond the glass door stretched the Nebraska plains, flat, patient, cut in half by a highway where trucks pass with a low, continuous roar. It sounds like a distant sea, one Martin Keller has never seen and no longer feels curious about. Rain taps the metal awning over the entrance, steady and indifferent, as if it has nowhere else to be. Martin sits on a folding chair near the wall. Its legs creak whenever he shifts his weight, so he tries not to move. On the table beside him stands a dented thermos, its lid scratched and dull. The coffee inside has long gone cold, a thin, oily film resting on the surface like something forgotten too late. He doesn't drink it. There is no reason to hurry the night. His hands tremble slightly, a small betrayal he has learned to manage by keeping them in his pockets. The habit is old now, like most things in his life. The warehouse has been empty for 2 years, yet he still guards it as if absence were something that could be stolen. He watches dust drift through the column of light, rising and falling in slow, careless patterns. It reminds him that even stillness has movement. Outside, another truck passes. Its headlights sweep briefly across the lobby, touching his face and moving on without pause. The rain continues, the light hums, and Martin remains where he is not waiting for anything in particular, only allowing the hours to move past him, one by one. In the far corner of the lobby stands a vending machine that no one services anymore. Its glass is cracked diagonally, like a healed bone that never set quite right. Inside, the shelves are mostly empty 2 bags of salted peanuts tilted on their sides, and 1 chocolate bar with a faded blue wrapper that looks brighter than it deserves to be. The machine emits a low, uneven hum, a mechanical breathing that fills the pauses between raindrops outside. Martin notices it every night, though he pretends not to. It has become part of the room's geometry, like a pillar or a stain on the floor. Still, his eyes return to it, drawn less by hunger than by the simple fact that it is one of the few things here that can still react. The warehouse does nothing. The walls listen without answering. The machine, at least, might respond. He reaches into his pocket and finds a single crumpled dollar bill. It is soft from being folded and unfolded too many times, the edges frayed, the ink tired. This is the last of his cash until Friday. It is useless for rent, meaningless for plans, and far too small to alter anything that matters. Its value exists only here, in this corner, under this flickering light. Martin smooths the bill against his knee, running his thumb along its creases until it lies almost flat. The paper feels warm from his body, briefly alive. He holds it there for a moment longer than necessary, listening to the machine's hum and the distant traffic beyond the glass. Then he stands slowly, as if the movement itself required consideration, and takes a step toward the corner. He stands in front of the machine, close enough to smell warm dust and old wiring. The metal slot is cold when his fingers touch it. Martin feeds the bill inside. The machine pulls it halfway, pauses, then pushes it back out with mild rejection. He tries again, the same result. On the 3rd attempt, the mechanism accepts it with a dull, resigned click, as if conceding not from willingness, but from fatigue. He presses the buttons carefully, B to 4. The plastic keys respond with a shallow snap that echoes more than it should in the empty space. For a moment, nothing happens. Then the spiral begins to turn slowly, deliberately, like a thought forming too late. The chocolate bar shifts forward, hesitates, clings to the coil as if reconsidering, and finally drops. The sound it makes when it hits the bottom is hollow and final, like a stone thrown into a dry well. Martin watches without expression. He knows this won't quiet his hunger, won't soften the long nights, or bring back the foundry that once gave shape to his days. It won't even taste good, but the machine has done what he asked. For a brief second, that is enough. In this building full of things that no longer answer to anyone, one small mechanism has obeyed him. The spiral has turned. Gravity has finished the task, and Martin stands there, motionless, aware that this minor mechanical compliance is the closest thing to control he has felt all night. He tears the wrapper open. The sound is dry, brittle, louder than expected. The chocolate smells faintly of sugar and something older, stale. Martin breaks off a small piece and puts it in his mouth, not rushing, not anticipating anything. The taste is exactly what he expects: cheap sweetness, tired cocoa, a dull coating that clings to the tongue. He chews slowly, staring through the glass doors into the dark. A truck passes on the highway, its headlights washing over the lobby for a second, catching his face in pale motion. The lines around his eyes deepen under the light, then disappear again. He doesn't follow the truck with his gaze. It has somewhere to go. The chocolate softens and melts, leaving behind a sticky aftertaste that isn't unpleasant so much as insistent. It doesn't offer comfort. It simply reminds him that his senses still function, that his body still registers small things. The realization comes without relief. Martin doesn't think about tomorrow, or about the years before the warehouse went quiet. He stands there until the sweetness fades, until there is nothing left to taste. When he swallows, the night feels unchanged, steady, neutral, intact. Martin returns to the table and rolls the empty blue wrapper into a small, uneven ball. He slips it back into his pocket, as if it might be useful later, or at least familiar. From the other pocket, he takes out a cigarette, tapping it once against his thumb before lighting it. The flame flares briefly, sharp and precise, then disappears. Smoke rises in thin strands, drifting upward to mingle with the slow dance of dust in the fluorescent light. Outside, the rain has stopped. What remains is the quiet drip from the edge of the awning, irregular now, almost hesitant. The highway noise continues, steady and distant, indifferent to the pause. Martin sits back down on the folding chair. It creaks once, then settles. The warehouse is silent again. Somewhere beyond the road, the world keeps moving without noticing his absence, and that feels appropriate. He closes his eyes for a moment, sensing the cigarette's warmth between his fingers. There are 6 hours left in the shift. The light above him flickers, then steadies, burning a little brighter, but Martin does not look up. Fading shadows of neon 9 in the evening settles over the small Pennsylvania town like a lid. According to the energy-saving plan, the main street sinks into half-light, shop windows dimming one by one, as if someone were carefully erasing a drawing they no longer intend to finish. The pavement still remembers the warmth of the day, but the air has already turned thin and indifferent. Jack stands across the street and watches the old miller's factory sign flicker. One letter goes dark, then another. The final crackle of electricity sounds like ice breaking on a frozen river, sharp, final, unnecessary. When the sign dies completely, it leaves behind not darkness, but absence, a space where meaning used to hang. The air smells of burnt fuel and dust, the kind that never quite settles. Darkness here does not arrive. It returns like an old owner reclaiming property after a long, careless lease. It fits the town too well, slipping between buildings into doorways, under memories that were never properly sealed. Without the glow of advertisements, the street looks older, almost honest. Brick facades lose their borrowed importance. Windows become just glass again. Jack feels the quiet weight of it press against his chest, not fear, not sadness, but the steady pressure of something familiar. He adjusts his jacket and turns away from the dead sign. Tomorrow, the lights will come back on, contracts permitting. Tonight, the town is allowed to look like what it has already become. Jack pushes the door of the diner near the railroad crossing. The bell above it rings once, tired, as if it regrets announcing anyone's arrival. Inside, the air is warmer but heavier, soaked with old coffee, grease, and the faint sweetness of cheap disinfectant. Time moves differently here. It slows, then hesitates, unsure whether to continue. Monica stands behind the counter, wiping its surface in long, unhurried strokes. The cloth leaves wet streaks that vanish almost immediately, absorbed by years of use. She does not look up. She doesn't need to. She knows Jack by sound alone, the dull rhythm of his boots, the soft creak of worn leather when he shifts his shoulders. The coffee machine hums quietly, a low mechanical breath. It is the only thing in the room that still seems to work without being asked twice. Jack takes his usual seat. The vinyl cushion exhales beneath his weight. Monica pours the coffee before he finishes speaking. Coffee? Black. The words fall between them and stay there, heavy and complete. Silence thickens, not awkward, not empty. It carries 10 years of small disappointments, postponed decisions, evenings that ended exactly like this one. Jack wraps his hands around the mug. The heat seeps into his fingers, then fades, as everything does. Outside, a train horn sounds somewhere far off, stretched thin by distance. Monica finally lifts her eyes, just for a second. They exchange a look that contains nothing dramatic, only recognition. In this place, that is more than enough. Without the advertisements, the town becomes unfamiliar. Stripped of glowing names and borrowed colors, the buildings stand exposed, either like ruins or like monuments, no longer sure which role they are meant to play. What once demanded attention now merely exists, solid and mute. Jack looks through the diner window into the dark. He remembers his father working here, back when the factory still breathed smoke and purpose. Back then, the chimneys spoke constantly, coughing black clouds into the sky as proof that something was being made, that effort still mattered. Now the chimneys are only silhouettes, black fingers, pointing upward at nothing. They accuse no one. They explain nothing. They simply remain, long after the hands that built them have grown still. A strange calm settles over Jack. It is the same feeling that comes when you realize progress was only a brief, noisy carnival, bright lights, loud promises, temporary joy. When the music stopped, nothing solid was left behind, only trash and silence. The town, relieved of illusion, seems older than it should be. Jack turns back toward the counter, understanding that what vanished tonight was not light, but pretense. Jack takes a camel without a filter from the crushed pack and brings it to his lips. The habit is older than most of his conclusions. He flicks the Zippo. Nothing. Again, the wheel grinds dry metal against metal, producing sparks that die before they can decide to exist. He keeps trying, more out of routine than hope. His thumb begins to tingle, then burn slightly, a small, precise pain. The lighter feels lighter than it should, as if even it has decided there is nothing left to give. Jack exhales through his nose and stares at the useless object in his hand. Monica reaches beneath the counter and slides a matchbox toward him. The printed advertisement on it has been rubbed nearly blank by years of pockets and fingers. Whatever it once promoted has long since gone out of business. She does not comment. She never does. Jack strikes a match. The flame appears suddenly, fragile and defiant, throwing a narrow circle of light across the counter. For a moment, it is the only honest light in the entire block. They both watch it, as if it were a small animal whose behavior cannot be predicted. The flame reflects in Monica's eyes. There is no joy in them, no pain either, only fatigue that has settled so deeply it has become part of her character. Jack lights the cigarette. The match burns down to his fingers, and he lets it fall, the darkness closing in again without protest. They speak about the parts factory that is closing at the end of the month. Not with anger, not even with bitterness, but with the flat precision of people listing weather facts. Jack worked there as a night guard. Monica had been an assistant in the accounting office until the software arrived and stayed. Nothing dramatic followed. There were no raised voices, no speeches. Only a series of short meetings, printed notices, and polite phrases that explained everything without meaning any of it. Work ended the way it often does now, quietly, efficiently, without witnesses. "We were never slow," Jack says after a while. His voice is calm, almost careful. "The world just got faster than our hands." The sentence lands between them not as poetry, but as a verdict. It needs no reply. Monica nods once. She has learned that agreement does not require elaboration. People like them do not complain. They inventory reality. Complaints suggest alternatives. Facts do not. The coffee cools. Outside, the crossing lights remain dark. For a moment, both of them sit very still, as if motion itself might demand an explanation they no longer feel obliged to give. Jack reaches into the pocket of his jacket and takes out an old wrench. It is short, heavy for its size, the metal worn smooth by years of work and handling. He turns it slowly between his fingers, the movement automatic, almost meditative. The steel is cold, polished to a dull shine where skin has passed over it thousands of times. It has outlasted jobs, buildings, and promises. Objects like this endure without explanation. They do not need to be updated or justified. Monica watches the wrench for a moment, then looks away. She understands the gesture without asking. Everyone keeps something that proves they once had a function. Outside, rain begins to fall. At first it is hesitant, tapping the diner's metal roof in scattered notes. Then it settles into a steady rhythm, slow and even, like a tired heartbeat that has decided to continue out of habit rather than hope. Jack closes his hand around the wrench and returns it to his pocket. The rain grows louder. Inside, nothing else changes, and that, too, feels appropriate. Jack finishes his coffee and stands. The movement feels heavier than it should, as if gravity has increased slightly while he wasn't paying attention. For a moment, he considers asking Monica to stay after her shift, to walk down to the river, to pretend that shared time could still rearrange outcomes. The thought passes without resistance. They both understand the rules of this place. Nothing is broken loudly anymore. Things simply stop extending into the future. Monica prints the bill and slides it across the counter. The paper is thin, already curling at the edges. Jack places a few coins beside it. They ring softly against the laminate, small, precise sounds that disappear almost as soon as they are made. Monica gathers the coins and nods once. It is not gratitude, not farewell, just acknowledgement. A transaction completed. The break happens then, without ceremony. Not when something shatters, but when it becomes clear that nothing new will be built. Jack turns toward the door and steps out into the rain, leaving his collar unbuttoned, as if there were no longer any reason to protect himself from the cold. Jack stops at the railroad crossing. The rain darkens his jacket, seeps into the seams, runs down his sleeves in thin, patient lines. The town behind him is blind and quiet, its streets resting as if relieved of their duties. Far down the tracks, a locomotive headlight appears. It is strong and merciless, a vertical pillar of light that cuts through the darkness without softening it. For an instant, the world sharpens, rails gleam, wet gravel shines, edges return. Then the train passes, and the light takes everything with it, leaving the night even deeper than before. Jack looks at his hands. In the dark, they seem unfamiliar, detached from intention, as if they belong to someone who has already finished his part. The rain keeps falling. The town sleeps, untroubled. Tomorrow, there will be electricity again. Signs will glow, machines will hum, noise will resume its duty. But standing there in the rain, among fading shadows, Jack feels free from the obligation of hope. A thin stream of smoke rises from his cigarette into the black sky. No promise follows it, only the brief afterimage of light, already gone. Paid silence. The day does not begin with movement. It begins with Miller sitting still. He sits in a cheap armchair by the window of room No. 12 at the Blue Star Motel. The fabric is worn smooth where other bodies have waited before him. Outside, an Ohio afternoon hangs in a flat gray pause. Nothing happens. A plastic bag drifts across the gas station lot, pushed and released by the wind, as if even it has nowhere to go. The room smells of old carpet and a sweet, chemical spray meant to erase memory. It does not succeed. The walls are thin. From the next room comes the sound of a man coughing dry, patient, practiced. Miller does not look toward the sound. He accepts it as part of the room, like the stains on the ceiling or the hum of the ice machine down the hall. On the small table lie two things, his wristwatch and a folded paper map. He knows the roads by heart, but he keeps the map anyway. The watch ticks loudly. Each second lands with mechanical insistence, filling the room with a nervous order that has nothing to do with him. Miller does not move. His jacket stays on. His hands rest on his thighs. He watches the reflection in the glass, his own face overlaid on the parking lot, the gas pumps, the slow drift of trash. The chair creaks when he shifts his weight, so he stops shifting. This is not waiting for something to happen. This is waiting because there is nothing else left to do. Miller's phone vibrates on the knit stand. The sound is small but sharp, like an insect trapped under glass. He lets it buzz once more before picking it up. A message from the app. A new tenant, Sarah. She asks why the living room blinds do not close all the way. Miller reads the sentence twice. He feels nothing. The question carries no irritation, no urgency. It is simply a request, clean and transactional, like money changing hands. He types slowly, using one thumb. You need to pull the cord harder. The one on the right. He sends it and places the phone face down, as if it might continue speaking if left uncovered. He sells himself in parts. The living room for $40. The bedroom for $60. The kitchen included, because it would be strange to charge extra for silence. Later, he tries to make coffee using the Motel machine. The plastic cup is too small. The water never gets hot enough. The coffee tastes thin, exhausted before it has begun. He drinks it anyway, standing by the sink, careful not to spill. This, too, is a routine injustice minor, reliable, impossible to correct. Back in the room, the phone lights up again. A confirmation. A check mark. Someone is inside his apartment now, opening drawers, touching light switches, learning the weight of his doors. Miller sits back down in the chair. He does not imagine them. Imagination would require energy. The watch keeps ticking. The room keeps holding him. And somewhere else, his home is being used exactly as intended. Miller steps outside to smoke. The motel air is damp and metallic, carrying the smell of wet asphalt and old oil. Near the reception, under a low tin awning, Hannah stands with her back to the wall. She works here. She lives here. The distinction is mostly administrative. She sees the cigarette in his hand and reaches out an ashtray without looking at him. Their fingers do not touch. The metal is cold. They stand side by side, not close, not far. When the rain starts, it does not announce itself. It simply begins, tapping the tin roof with a hollow, measured sound. It resembles something being sealed shut. Neither of them speaks. Hannah's cigarette burns down slowly. The ember glows, then dims, then glows again. It is the only thing in motion that feels intentional. Miller watches it without thinking. He watches the ash grow long and fall. He does not ask her where she came from. She does not ask him where he is going. The rain thickens. The parking lot darkens. A car passes on the road, its tires hissing through water, already gone before either of them turns their head. Miller exhales smoke. Hannah exhales smoke. The air accepts both without preference. They know nothing about each other. This is the highest form of courtesy they can offer. When the rain eases, Hannah stubs out her cigarette and steps back inside. Miller remains under the awning for a moment longer, holding his own until it burns his fingers. It is Sunday. Miller stands in front of his apartment door and waits. The app says the guests have checked out. He waits 5 minutes anyway. He has learned that time is softer when you do not rush it, and cruel when you do. The hallway smells clean, recently aired out. Someone has tried to be considerate. This makes it worse. When he unlocks the door, the apartment does not welcome him. The air feels wrong too neutral, stripped of weight. Windows have been opened, curtains shifted. The room carries a quiet that does not belong to him. It is the silence left after people have finished using a place. He steps inside and closes the door carefully, as if noise might disturb whatever remains. On the floor near the couch lies a pink hair tie. It is small, elastic, slightly misshapen. It looks like a living thing that has lost its purpose. Miller does not pick it up. He only looks at it, noting how foreign it feels against his wooden floor. He understands something then, without surprise. Home is not where your furniture is. Home is where your smell has not been erased. He walks through the room slowly. The bathroom mirror has been wiped clean. The kitchen counter shines. Everything is in order. Nothing is his. Miller stands in the middle of the apartment, hands in his jacket pockets, and waits for the feeling to pass. It does not. He goes into the bedroom last. The sheets are gone, folded, removed with care. The guests were decent people. That, too, is a form of damage. The mattress lies exposed, pale and uneven, marked by years of weight and heat. Miller stands over it without sitting down. He already knows what he will find, but knowledge does not make it easier. He bends forward. The smell is still there. Sweet, heavy, perfume mixed with the warmth of another body, trapped deep in the fabric. It is not unpleasant. That is the worst part. It does not offend him. It simply does not belong to him. Miller straightens up. He does not strip the mattress. He does not open the windows. There is no ritual left that could fix this. He lies down fully clothed, his jacket still on, shoes on the floor but not far away. The mattress does not recognize him. It gives back no familiar resistance. He stares at the ceiling. The room feels rented even now. For the first time that day, Miller understands his position clearly. He is not the owner who returned. He is the last guest, sleeping in the remains of someone else's night. Evening settles without asking. Miller stands in the kitchen and opens a can of soup. The sound is sharp and final. He pours it into a pot and sets it on the stove. The burner clicks twice before the flame catches. Blue light licks the metal bottom with patient indifference. He notices the knives first. They are in the wrong drawer. Not lost, not stolen. Just placed elsewhere, as if someone had briefly inhabited his habits and rearranged them for convenience. The salt container is open. A thin white ring has formed around its base. He closes it carefully, wiping the grains with his thumb. These are not violations. They are adjustments. The soup warms slowly. He does not stir it. The spoon rests untouched on the counter. The chrome faucet reflects the flame. His hands, the edge of the sink, everything doubled, slightly distorted. He watches the reflection instead of the pot. Every small change made by strangers registers in his body as pressure. Not pain, pressure. He cannot blame them. They paid for access. They followed the rules. They left the place cleaner than they found it. That is what hurts. Miller eats standing up. The soup tastes the same as always salted, anonymous, filling nothing except space. When he is done, he rinses the pot and places it back exactly where it belongs. He restores order not because it helps, but because it proves that the disorder was temporary. Miller sits in the dark. He does not turn on the lights. Light would expose the arrangement left behind by other people, and he is tired of learning how they prefer things to be. Darkness at least does not take sides. Through the window, the highway glows in the distance. Headlights move steadily, one direction replacing another, an endless exchange of people looking for a place to stop. None of them stay long. That is the only rule that still works. The fatigue in his body does not belong to the day. Sleep will not remove it. It is the weight of someone who has measured his privacy, priced it, and agreed to the number because there was no alternative. He closes his eyes. He tries to remember how the apartment smelled 2 years ago. Not what it looked like. Not where the furniture stood. Only the smell. The attempt fails quietly. Memory offers nothing solid to hold. What remains is the sweet, unfamiliar trace in the mattress, and the sound of rain touching the glass with steady patience. Miller breathes in, then out. This is not an ending. It is simply another night that does not promise a morning. What remains after the sale? The town ends where the cornfields begin. Nebraska has many places like this, but this one has learned not to pretend otherwise. The main street narrows, then simply gives up. At its edge stands the pawnshop, its window filled with a thin layer of road dust that never fully settles, never fully lifts. Inside, the air smells of metal, old fabric, and time that has stopped caring. A wall clock ticks 4 minutes behind the world. Henry has never corrected it. He wipes the counter with an old rag, slow and methodical. He does not look at the door. He knows when it will open. The sun must reach a certain angle above the gas station across the street. Things obey patterns here, even people. None of the objects on the shelves carry price tags. They have stories instead, stories everyone wants to forget. The first man comes in quietly. A worn John Deere cap, sweat darkening the brim. He places a wedding ring on the counterfold, polished by years of habit rather than care. Henry does not weigh it. He turns it gently, feeling the smooth friction marks on the inside. The ring is cold. The man's hands are not. Henry names a price. Too much for the gold. Too little for what is gone. The man nods. The bills disappear into a pocket without being counted. That is how most transactions end here. Later, Henry steps out back to smoke. A Camel without a filter. The yard holds a rusted Ford pickup sitting on bare hubs like an animal picked clean. His coffee in a paper cup has gone cold. A thin skin has formed on top. He studies his hands dry, cracked, shaped by years of touching other people's lives. There is no reason to hurry. Time here does not move forward. It circles until it wears itself smooth. Just before noon, a woman enters. Her coat is too light for the wind. She sets a small silver spoon on the counter, engraved with the letter M. It is bent not by accident, but by long pressure, as if someone had held it too tightly for too long. Henry does not meet her eyes. He watches her fingers tremble as they search for cigarettes in an empty pocket. He knows this spoon is everything that remains of her house. He gives her enough money for a bus ticket. The buses here are never on time. In the dim afternoon, Henry sorts the day's intake. The ring beside the spoon. Objects arranged like an inventory of quiet defeats. He understands then, as he often does, that he is not buying metal. He is buying permission for people to walk away lighter. Outside, the neon open sign flickers, buzzing softly, filling the space between the walls. From yesterday's lot, he opens a guitar case. Beneath the lining lies a photograph. 2 young men in uniform, smiling over cheap beer. One corner is burned. For a moment, he considers throwing it away. Instead, he places it back and closes the case. War, wherever it happens, leaves the same ruins behind. At dusk, the sun drops behind factory chimneys. Henry pours cheap bourbon into a dusty glass. No words, just the burn in his throat, proof that he is still here. A lone truck passes outside, its headlights briefly waking the shells of abandoned hopes. Before closing, he stops at a mirror brought in that morning. Old, spotted, unreliable. It shows his face distorted, crowded with others. The man, the woman, the weight they left behind. He is the town's archivist. He keeps what no one else will. He locks the door, turns the sign to closed. Wind pushes a plastic bag along the empty street. Tomorrow will be the same. He lights his last cigarette. For a moment, the match reveals his face without hope, but held together by a strange, steady endurance. Morning arrives without intention. The light slips in through the dusty glass as if it does not want to be noticed. Henry unlocks the door before the street fully wakes. The neon sign stays dark. There is no need to announce anything yet. People will come regardless. He brews coffee that tastes of burned water and habit. The clock is still 4 minutes late. It always will be. Some delays become part of the structure, like cracks in concrete that no one repairs because they no longer threaten collapse. The first hour passes without customers. Henry listens to the building breathe pipes ticking, wood shifting, the faint hum from the refrigeration unit in the neighboring liquor store. Silence here is never empty. It is only waiting. A man enters near mid-morning, younger than most, clean jacket, careful posture. He sets a watch on the counter, not expensive, not cheap, military issue. The glass is scratched, the strap replaced twice. Henry does not ask where it came from. The man does not volunteer anything. It still works, the man says, as if defending it. Henry nods. He holds the watch to his ear. The ticking is steady, indifferent. Time does not remember who wore it. He names a price. Fair. Precisely fair. The man hesitates longer than expected, then agrees. Relief crosses his face, not happiness, just release. When he leaves, he forgets to take the receipt. By noon, the dust outside has thickened. A truck idles too long at the intersection, then moves on. Henry eats a sandwich he does not taste. He rearranges the shelves, spacing objects farther apart, as if giving them room to breathe. A harmonica, a locket, a dented Zippo lighter that still smells faintly of gasoline and winter. He understands now that fairness is the most dangerous illusion he offers. A fair price suggests balance. But nothing brought through that door has ever been balanced. People trade weight for motion, pain for distance. The exchange is always uneven. In the afternoon, no one comes. Henry sits behind the counter, hands folded, eyes unfocused. He thinks of the ring, the spoon, the photograph. None of them belong to him, yet all of them stay. Ownership here is temporary. Absence is permanent. When evening approaches, he switches on the neon sign. It flickers once, then steadies. Open. The word feels less like an invitation and more like a confession. At closing time, Henry does not drink. He stands by the window and watches the road fade into fields. He feels the quiet settle into his bones, heavy but familiar. Tomorrow will ask the same question it always does, and he will answer it with the only currency he has left, silence, measured carefully, sold at the best possible price. The third day of the week always feels heavier. Nothing in the town acknowledges it, but Henry does. By Wednesday, whatever resolve people carried in on Monday has usually worn thin. They come in slower now, less defensive, as if the building itself has already finished the negotiation for them. The bell above the door rings twice before noon. An old man enters, moving carefully, like someone navigating a space he no longer trusts. He carries a cardboard box tied with twine. He sets it down without sitting. Inside are medals. Campaign ribbons faded to the color of dry blood. A folded flag, creased too many times. Henry does not unfold it. These don't do much anymore, the old man says. His voice is steady, practiced. Henry agrees. He does not say that they never really did. The price is symbolic. The old man accepts it without comment. When he leaves, he pauses at the door, as if something might call him back. Nothing does. In the afternoon, heat presses against the windows. The dust outside turns the sky pale, almost gentle. Henry catalogs the medals, writes descriptions no one will read. He notices how often the word service appears, and how little it explains. Objects like these resist usefulness. They exist to be endured. A boy comes in later, barely 18. He carries a guitar with a cracked neck and eyes that refuse to settle. He asks how much it's worth before setting it down. Henry tells him the truth. The boy laughs once, sharp and surprised, then nods. He takes the cash and leaves without the guitar. He does not look back. Near closing, Henry opens the register to balance the day, and numbers add up cleanly. That unsettles him more than a mistake would have. Order suggests intention. There is none here. He locks the medals away, places the guitar on a lower shelf where it will not be noticed. The shop feels fuller, though nothing is grown. It is the accumulation of what remains after meaning has been removed. When the light finally fades, Henry turns off the neon and sits in the dark. He understands now that the pawn shop does not collect things. It collects endings. Each object is proof that someone chose motion over memory. Outside, the fields disappear into shadow. Inside, the clock continues its quiet rebellion, 4 minutes behind, refusing to arrive where it is expected. Henry lets it. Some delays are merciful. Thursday arrives with wind. Not enough to clear the dust, only enough to move it around. The street looks briefly altered, as if something might change its mind, then settles back into the same arrangement. Henry opens the shop later than usual. The delay feels earned. The first visitor does not come to sell. She walks the shelves slowly, hands clasped behind her back, reading the objects as if they were captions beneath photographs. A teacher, perhaps, or someone who once was. She asks the age of a radio she has no intention of buying. Henry answers precisely. Precision is a habit here, not a courtesy. She leaves with nothing, but the air feels disturbed after she goes, as if a question was almost asked and chose not to exist. Near midday, a mechanic brings in a toolbox. Heavy, well used. The latch is broken. It stays shut by force of memory. When Henry opens it, the smell of oil and iron fills the room. Each tool bears a handle worn into a specific shape, made by one pair of hands over decades. The mechanic watches closely, jaw tight, as if the tools might protest. Henry names a number. The man exhales, nods once, and turns away before the money is fully counted. He does not say goodbye. Some farewells weaken the decision. After lunch, the shop stays empty. Henry sits behind the counter, listening to the clock and the hum of electricity in the walls. He thinks about how weight transfers, how some people walk in bent and leave lighter, while the room itself grows heavier with every exchange. Nothing here evaporates. It only changes owners. Late afternoon brings rain that never quite falls. The sky darkens, threatening effort, then gives up. Henry turns on the neon sign early. Open flickers, steadies, lies. A teenager enters just before closing. She holds a small digital camera, outdated but intact. Her fingers hesitate on the strap. She asks what it's worth without meeting his eyes. Henry studies the lens, still clear, still capable of recording moments no one will revisit. He offers less than she hoped, more than it deserves. She accepts immediately, almost too quickly, and leaves with relief that borders on guilt. When the door closes, Henry turns the sign to closed and does not lock it right away. He stands there, hand on the key, feeling the accumulated pressure of the day. The tools, the camera, the things people mistake for weight until they are gone. Outside, the wind dies. The dust settles again. Henry locks the door. The sound is final, but not decisive. Nothing ever is. Friday sharpens people. They arrive with decisions already rehearsed, movements cleaner, voices more certain. By the end of the week, hesitation feels expensive. Henry opens on time. The clock is still wrong. He no longer notices. The morning brings a man in a pressed shirt and borrowed confidence. He places a set of cufflinks on the counter, silver, understated. Wedding gifts, unused. The man explains too much, then stops mid-sentence, as if remembering where he is. Henry listens without comment. He turns the links over, notes the absence of wear. Objects like these never learned their purpose. The price is modest. The man accepts it with a nod that feels like closure. When he leaves, the explanation stays behind, hanging briefly in the air, before settling into nothing. Later, a woman brings in a violin case. The instrument inside is chipped, the strings uneven, the bow re-haired badly. She says it belonged to her daughter. She does not say where her daughter is now. Henry does not ask. He knows the violin will never be played again, at least not as it once was. He offers enough to matter, not enough to insult the memory. She holds the case a moment longer, then lets go. The sound it makes on the counter is dull, almost respectful. In the quiet afternoon, Henry records serial numbers, descriptions, conditions. He notices how often his handwriting slows when the item carries a past. As if caution might preserve something, it never does. He understands now that every transaction here follows the same arithmetic. Value minus attachment equals movement. The more attachment, the harder the subtraction. Some people arrive with nothing left to calculate. As evening approaches, the shop fills briefly two quick sales. A watch, a broken tablet, a pair of work boots with the soles nearly gone. Functional losses, easier to release. Henry processes them efficiently, without ceremony. At closing, he pours a drink, but does not raise it. He sets the glass down untouched. The shelves feel crowded, though there is still space. What accumulates here is not quantity, but residue. Henry turns off the lights one by one. In the dark, the objects lose their outlines and become uniform, indistinct, equal at last. He locks the door and steps into the evening. The week is finished. The weight remains. Saturday carries a different posture. People walk in as if they have already forgiven themselves. The town is quieter, but not calmer. Henry opens the shop and leaves the door unlocked longer than usual. The bell stays silent. That, too, is a message. Late morning brings a couple. They do not stand close. Between them, on the counter, they place a small wooden box. Inside, photographs, loose and unarranged. Vacations. A kitchen table. A child with missing teeth. None of the images are labeled. They ask if he buys photos. Henry says no. They look at each other, relief passing between them, then thank him and leave with the box untouched. The door closes softly. Some things resist exchange, not because they are sacred, but because selling them would require agreement. After noon, a man with stained hands brings in a power drill that still works. He tests it on the floor, the sound harsh and sudden. Henry flinches before he can stop himself. The man apologizes. The apology is unnecessary. Noise only feels intrusive because the room has learned to absorb silence. The price is quick. The drill stays. In the afternoon, Henry opens the safe and looks at what he keeps separate. The ring, the spoon, the photograph. He does not know why these remain unprocessed. They do not belong to him, yet they refuse to become inventory. He closes the safe without rearranging anything. A storm threatens again, but never commits. The air grows heavy, expectant. Henry sits behind the counter, hands flat, feeling the grain of the wood worn smooth by decades of bargains. He understands now that the shop is not a place of endings, but of pause, a holding pattern for lives in transition. Just before evening, a boy returns, the one who left the guitar days ago. He stands uncertainly near the door. "Is it still here?" he asks. Henry nods. The boy does not ask the price. He pays what Henry asks without argument and carries the guitar out with both hands, careful now. When he leaves, the bell rings once, clear and unbroken. At closing, Henry does not drink. He turns the sign to closed and sits in the quiet. Something has shifted, though nothing has improved. Some things leave, most stay, and the shop remains open to both. Sunday does not arrive with customers. It arrives with stillness. Henry opens the shop out of habit, not expectation. The street is empty, the gas station quiet, the fields unmoving. Even the dust seems to rest. He does not turn on the neon sign. Open would feel dishonest today. Instead, he sits behind the counter and lets the room exist without instruction. The clock continues its uneven duty. 4 minutes late, faithful in its refusal. Mid-morning, he cleans. Not because the place needs it, but because motion requires justification. He wipes the glass, rearranges shelves that do not benefit from order, straightens objects that have already surrendered their alignment. The act is ceremonial, almost private. He thinks about endurance, not as strength, but as shape. How people bend around loss rather than confront it. How this town has done the same. Cornfields pressing in, factories hollowed out, a main street that learned how to stop. No one comes to sell. No one comes to buy. The silence is complete enough to feel deliberate. In the afternoon, Henry pours coffee and lets it cool untouched. He stands at the window and watches a single cloud drag its shadow across the fields. Movement without direction, purpose without outcome. It feels familiar. He understands now that the pawn shop survives not because of profit, but because it gives form to what cannot be kept. It does not resolve pain. It organizes it, puts it on shelves, keeps it from spilling into the street. As evening approaches, Henry locks the door early. He does not flip the sign. Closed requires an audience. He sits in the dark until the light fades completely. There is no relief in this day, but there is clarity. Endurance, he realizes, is not resistance. It is the willingness to remain intact while carrying weight that was never meant to be held. When he leaves, the town does not notice. It rarely does, and yet by staying, he has done his part. Monday returns without apology. The shop opens on time. The neon sign hums, steady now, as if it has learned the rhythm of the place. Henry feels older than he did the week before, though nothing in his body confirms it. The change is internal. Those are the only ones that last. A man arrives early with a sealed envelope. He does not sit. He places it on the counter like an object that might react if handled incorrectly. "I don't want money," he says. "I just need it somewhere." Henry does not ask what is inside. He does not open it. He writes a name on a small tag and slides it into a drawer that does not appear on the inventory list. Some deposits are not meant to be redeemed. The rest of the morning passes in fragments. A woman pawns a bracelet she never wore. A farmer sells binoculars with one cracked lens. A child looks at a row of watches and asks which one tells the truth. Henry says none of them. The child accepts this and leaves. By afternoon, the room feels balanced in a way it rarely does. Not lighter, just evenly weighted. Henry updates his ledger, lines clean, numbers correct. He realizes he is no longer recording transactions. He is documenting transfer, who arrived heavy, who left lighter, and what remained behind to absorb the difference. Near closing, he opens the mirror again, the one with the spotted glass. His reflection looks familiar today. Less crowded, still worn, but singular. He touches the frame and lets his hand fall. When he locks the door, he feels no ceremony, only completion. The ledger is closed, not finished closed. Outside, a truck passes. The dust lifts, then settles. The town holds its shape. Henry walks home without looking back. Some accounts do not need to be revisited. They only need to be kept. The last evening of the cycle arrives quietly, like a correction rather than an ending. Henry closes earlier than usual. The sun is still up, hanging low over the gas station, caught at the angle he has always trusted. For once, the door does not open. For once, the door does not open. Inside, the shop feels finished, not emptied finished. The shelves hold what they will hold. The air has settled into itself. Even the clock seems less defiant. Its delay no longer an argument, but a feature, like a scar that is healed into shape. Henry moves through the room slowly, touching nothing. He knows where everything is without looking. The ring, the spoon, the photograph, the guitar that left and returned to the world, the envelope in the drawer that will never be claimed. This is not inventory. It is a balance sheet no bank would recognize. He pours the last of the bourbon into the dusty glass and finally drinks it. The burn is softer now. Or maybe his throat has learned what to expect. He thinks of all the prices he named, all of them precise, none of them true. Fairness was never the goal. Containment was. At the mirror, he stops one final time. The glass shows him as he is, older than the week, younger than the town. Behind his reflection, the room waits without demand. He understands then that he has not been selling release. He has been storing it, holding what others could not carry until it no longer resisted being held. Henry turns the sign for the last time. Closed. The word lands without weight. Outside, the street is empty. A plastic bag skitters across the asphalt and disappears into the fields. He locks the door, pockets the key, and does not look back. Tomorrow will come. It always does. But tonight, the ledger balances. Iron wind. The scene does not begin with a man, but with light. The sun lowers itself onto piles of scrap as if testing their weight, turning rust into a dull amber. Under the fading Iowa sky, metal exhales heat it has stored all day. The wind moves through empty radiators and broken frames, producing a sound that is not a voice, only persistence. Hages stands in the yard with a warm cup of coffee cradled in his hand. He does not look at the sky. He watches shadows lengthen across the ground, stretching the iron shapes he has welded into forms resembling birds that never learned the reason for wings. His hands smell of iron and old grease. The smell does not leave him, even at night. He lowers the cup and reaches for the torch. A truck spring and the bent frame of a child's bicycle refuse each other. The arc flashes. For a moment, everything is too bright, as if the world has been overexposed and corrected itself out of habit. The metal cools without yielding. An engine rattles at the roadside. Ellen's car waits there, neither approaching nor leaving. She stays inside, long enough to finish one cigarette. The smoke is torn apart by the wind before it can decide where to go. Hages understands then that nothing he builds will ever lift. The weight is not a mistake. It is a property. He is not making art. He is marking what cannot be repaired. Ellen steps out, hands him a small rusted keychain found in a motel room. Their fingers touch cold, brief, sufficient. He welds it to the beak of the iron bird. The gesture solves nothing, but the piece is finished. When night comes, the town goes dark. The wind remains. The metal does not move. Morning arrives without intention. It spreads itself thin over the yard, pale and functional, like a light left on for no one. Hages wakes before the generator calls to life. His body knows the hour, even when clocks fail. The cold sits deeper now, inside the joints, where metal fatigue would form if bones admitted such language. He washes his face at the outdoor sink. The water is sharp, metallic, as if it remembers where it has been. Above him, the iron birds stand unchanged. Dew gathers on their seams, tracing weld lines like tired handwriting. They look heavier in daylight, stripped of yesterday's illusion. He tries again. A different piece, this time rebar bent into a curve, the corner of a washing machine drum. The torch hums, sparks fall and die quickly, obedient. The weld holds, but the shape resists meaning. Hages does not correct it. Correction implies a future use. By noon, a truck passes without stopping. It kicks dust against the fence and carries on, satisfied with its own motion. Hages eats standing up. Bread, meat, nothing requiring thought. His hands keep moving even while he chews, adjusting clamps, checking seams that will never be tested. In the distance, the motel sign flickers once and steadies. Ellen will clean the same rooms today. sheets that remember bodies better than names. She will find nothing worth keeping. Hages sits on a coil of wire and watches heat rise from the ground. The wind shifts direction, dragging the smell of oil across the yard. He breathes it in without judgment. This is not survival. It is maintenance. When evening comes, he does not look for Ellen's car. Some patterns only exist because they repeat. Others end quietly, like machines unplugged from walls that no longer supply power. The afternoon collapses inward, becoming denser without growing darker. Heat lingers where it has no work left to do. Hages stops welding, not because he is finished, but because the metal has stopped responding in any meaningful way. He sets the torch down carefully, as if it could be offended. The iron birds hold their ground. From certain angles they appear almost balanced, caught in a moment before motion. Hages circles them slowly. He knows every joint, every compromise hidden in their frames. The flaws are not accidents. They are where his hands hesitated. A wind gust rattles loose sheet metal against the fence. The sound is abrupt, impatient. It reminds him of factory alarms that once dictated his breathing. Back then, noise had authority. Now it only interrupts. Ellen's car does not appear. The road stays empty, stretched thin under the sky. Hages notices the absence without naming it. Absence is easier to handle when it remains theoretical. He sits inside the workshop and sharpens a rod that will never cut. The grinder screams briefly, then goes quiet. Silence returns heavier than before, pressing against the walls. In it, Hages understands that waiting has become a skill, one he practices without reward. As dusk approaches, the light catches a new angle on the sculptures. Their shadows no longer resemble birds. They are just mass, leaning toward the ground that will eventually take them back. Hages closes the door. The lock clicks with a sound too small for the decision it represents. Outside, the wind continues its work, moving everything except what has already accepted its weight. Rain comes without warning, not as a storm, but as a correction. The dust settles first, then the sound follows, light, steady, indifferent. Hages stands under the awning and watches droplets strike metal, each impact brief and final. The yard darkens, rust deepening into something closer to memory. He steps back into the open and lets the rain soak his jacket. Water runs along weld seams, collecting where heat once forced things together. The iron birds take on a dull sheen, their surfaces smoothed by moisture that will later eat them from within. Nothing resists. Everything endures in its own way. A car slows on the road. Ellen's headlights cut through the rain and stop. This time she does not turn the engine off. She lowers the window enough to let the smoke escape. They exchange a look that contains no question. The rain fills the space words might have occupied. Hages lifts a hand. Not a wave, just acknowledgement. She nods once and drives on. The red lights dissolve quickly, swallowed by the gray. He returns to the workshop and picks up a piece he had set aside weeks ago, a cracked mirror from a truck. He welds its frame onto one of the birds, facing inward. When he steps back, his reflection appears fractured, stretched thin across metal that does not recognize him. The generator hums through the rain. Night lowers itself slowly. Hages sits, wet and still, watching water erase the day's dust. The birds remain. The wind waits. Night completes what the day only suggested. The yard contracts into smaller shapes, reduced to silhouettes and sound. The generator's hum becomes the only steady thing, a reminder that motion still exists somewhere nearby, even if it no longer serves a purpose. Hages sits on an overturned tire, hands resting on his knees. They ache now, not sharply, but with the dull insistence of metal cooling after long use. The iron birds stand before him, heavier in the dark, anchored by their own certainty. They do not sway when the wind passes through them. The wind adjusts instead. Across the road, the motel lights flicker off one by one. Somewhere inside, Ellen locks a door, leaves a key where it will be found by morning, and drives home along the same stretch of road that never remembers her. Hagis imagines this without effort. Routine has made imagination efficient. He reaches into his pocket and finds nothing. This absence feels correct. There is no object left that needs to be placed, no final adjustment waiting for his hands. The sculptures are finished in the only way they can be. The generator stutters, then settles again. Hagis does not look up. He watches the dark press gently against the fence, testing its limits. It does not break through. When the generator finally goes silent, the quiet that follows is complete. Iron, night, and wind remain balanced, unremarkable, and sufficient. Coffee, graphite, and sky. The sky above Missouri looked undecided, as if even the weather had grown tired of choosing. It did not rain. It did not clear. It simply pressed downward, a dull gray weight settling over the flat roofs and empty parking lots. Inside Lincoln's diner, the light filtered through greasy windows and fell in a thin, reluctant beam across the tables. Silas sat alone with a heavy ceramic cup before him. The rim was chipped. His thumb rested against the fracture, as though testing a wound. The coffee was black and harsh, smelling faintly of burnt beans and treated water. It scalded his tongue, but he welcomed the pain. It proved that something still responded. On the next table lay a faded newspaper. The date printed at the top might have been yesterday or 10 years ago. It no longer mattered. Headlines spoke in bold letters about urgency, but urgency had already drained from the room. Even the clock above the counter ticked without conviction. A shaft of sunlight broke through the cloud cover and entered the diner like a hesitant visitor. It illuminated the dust suspended in the air. The particles drifted slowly, without direction, without purpose. Silas watched them with the patience of a man who has stopped expecting revelation. His hands rested around the cup. Once, they had been precise, sensitive to the smallest curve of a cheek, the faintest shadow beneath an eye. Now they felt coarse, like tools left too long in damp air. He flexed his fingers and felt only stiffness. He had spent decades searching for a face worth finishing. Not beauty, not tragedy, just truth. But the truth, he suspected now, might be something smoother than bone and quieter than breath. The light shifted. The dust continued its slow descent. Nothing in the room resisted it. And for the first time, Silas felt that the absence beneath the layers was not a failure. It was simply what remained. Silas opened the sketchbook as one might open an old letter carefully, without hope. The paper had yellowed along the edges, curling slightly at the corners as if retreating from time. A faint dust of graphite marked the margins, ghosts of faces that had almost existed. Across the room, the waitress leaned against the counter. Her name tag read Annie, though the letters were worn thin. She watched a muted weather report flicker on a small television mounted near the ceiling. Storm symbols drifted across a map, without sound, promising movement that might never arrive. Silas began with the line of her chin. His pencil hesitated, then moved. The stroke was uncertain. He paused, frowned, and erased it. A pale gray scar remained. He tried again this time. The curve was too sharp, too deliberate. It belonged to someone else. He erased once more. The third attempt dissolved into a smudge. Each effort to give her a feature stripped something away. The woman before him became less Annie and more a figure in an apron, a posture behind a counter. Identity thinned beneath repetition. She approached to refill his cup. The coffee poured in a steady, patient stream. Their eyes met above the rising steam. Neither asked anything of the other. In the brief silence between the pour and the soft knock of ceramic against wood, there was something almost human. Then it passed. She returned to the counter. The television flickered. The map shifted. Silas looked down at the page. Where a face should have been, there was only a growing field of gray. Silas lifted his eyes from the page and let them wander across the diner. In the corner sat a truck driver, shoulders broad, hands wrapped around a plate he no longer seemed hungry for. Near the window, an elderly couple shared a silence so practiced it required no effort. They all possessed features, eyes, mouths, lines carved by time, but something in them felt provisional, as though their faces were arrangements that could be altered without consequence. He studied the driver first. The man's jaw was heavy, his brow furrowed in habitual concentration. Yet the expression did not belong to him alone. It could have been exchanged with any other man who had driven too long along straight roads. The wrinkles were not history. They were weather. The old woman by the window adjusted her glasses. Light caught the lenses, erasing her eyes for a moment. When the glare faded, her gaze held nothing that asked to be remembered. She was present, but only as continuation, not as revelation. A strange calm entered Silas then. He had searched for decades for a face that carried meaning, the American face. He once called it in private, as if naming it would make it surface. He had expected heroism or sorrow, defiance or ruin. Instead, he saw level grayness, stretched wide between highways and cornfields. It was not tragic. It was not profound. It was simply there. He looked back at the sketchbook. The blank space where Annie's features should have formed seemed honest now, not unfinished accurate. The absence did not accuse him. It relieved him. Coffee cooled in his cup. No one noticed. And for the first time, he understood that what he had taken for mystery was only emptiness, patiently waiting to be recognized. Silas did not hesitate this time. He placed the pencil against the page and pressed harder than necessary. The graphite moved in dense, deliberate strokes. He did not search for contour or shadow. He did not attempt correction. He covered the space where Annie's face might have been with a firm, unbroken darkness. The motion felt almost violent, yet there was no anger in it, only decision. Layer upon layer, the paper accepted the weight. The pale smudges disappeared beneath a uniform shade. The chin, the imagined mouth, the uncertain eyes, all dissolved into a single field of gray. It was not a portrait anymore. It was a statement. He set the pencil down carefully, as one sets down a tool after completing necessary work. From his wallet, he removed a $5 bill and placed it beneath the coffee cup. It was more than the coffee required. Excess felt appropriate. Payment not for the drink, but for the quiet permission to see clearly. Annie approached, gathered the bill without comment, and slipped it into her apron. With a damp cloth, she wiped the table in small circular motions. The crumbs of graphite and pencil shavings vanished into the fabric. She did not look at the sketch. Nothing in the diner shifted. The truck driver continued eating. The couple remained suspended in their shared stillness. The television changed from clouds to sunshine on the map. Silas closed the sketchbook. The world did not protest the erasure. It accepted it, as it accepts cooling coffee and fading light. Outside, the air felt heavier, as though the sky had descended another inch. Silas paused beside the door of the diner and let it close behind him without sound. A parking lot stretched wide and almost empty. A thin film of dust lay across the asphalt, softening the edges of oil stains and tire marks. His car stood near the motel sign, coated in the same pale residue. He ran his fingers across the hood and left a clean streak that quickly seemed accidental, almost intrusive. The dust had settled with quiet authority. It belonged there more than his hand did. He lit a cigarette. The flame flared briefly, then steadied. Smoke rose in a straight, narrow column. There was no wind to bend it. The stillness felt deliberate, as if the world were holding its breath without expectation. For a moment, he looked back at the diner window. From this distance, the interior was reduced to shapes in light. Faces, if they were visible at all, were indistinct. It made no difference. He slid behind the wheel. The engine turned over with a tired obedience. Ahead, The highway ran straight between empty cornfields, disappearing into a horizon that promised nothing and threatened nothing. As he shifted into gear, the western sky acquired a faint yellow tint, almost beautiful, almost hopeful. He regarded it without longing. It was light, and it meant nothing. He eased the car forward. The road accepted him without ceremony, and the dust rose gently behind, settling again as though he had never passed. Gray light over Iowa. The neon outside the Blue Star Diner flickered with a stubborn, arthritic pulse, surrendering every second letter to the dark. Beyond the window lay Iowa flat, exhausted, stripped of promise. The rain did not smell of earth or growth. It carried only dampness, a thin film that settled on skin and stayed there like an unspoken accusation. Robert sat at the counter with his shoulders bent forward, as if the air itself were heavy. His jacket clung to him, darkened by rain. Mud from his boots stained the yellowed linoleum in slow, patient prints. In the blackened glass he studied his reflection, a face worn thin at the edges, as though life had been erasing it line by line. It looked less like a man than a draft someone had forgotten to finish. From his pocket he unfolded the bank notice. The paper was softened at the corners, rubbed gray by restless fingers. The numbers did not argue. They did not plead. They merely increased quietly, methodically like rust spreading along a forgotten beam. His father's copied signature sat at the bottom, a brittle relic of a promise never kept. Robert ran his finger over it, not in anger but in recognition. The debt was not a sum. It was an inheritance. Sloane approached without asking questions. In places like this, inquiry was an intrusion. She filled his cup to the rim so that he had to bend close, careful not to spill. Their eyes met above the steam brief, unadorned. Two people fastened to parallel tracks, acknowledging each other without hope of derailment. Robert felt the collar of his coat against his neck. It had belonged to his father. He remembered him less as a man than as a smell-cheap tobacco mingled with quiet defeat. The realization settled slowly. The debt was not money. It was borrowed time. Each hour at the factory was an hour his father had already spent decades ago. Despair, he understood, was not traumatic. It was chronic. You learned to carry it the way others carried keys. Under the table, his hand closed around an old wrench from the second job. It was cold, indifferent, heavier than it needed to be. The metal did not warm to his touch. In towns like this, objects endured. Men did not. Factories remained upright, while those inside them folded inward. The weight in his palm reminded him that he was only another tool in a design drawn long before he arrived. He stepped outside for a cigarette. Rain hissed softly against the ember. Smoke drifted into the low fog and vanished without resistance. For a moment, he owed nothing. No one demanded anything of him. It was a sterile freedom, thin as the air, tasting faintly of wet asphalt. When he returned, he placed a $5 bill on the counter tomorrow's lunch. It was not generosity. It was a gesture, small and precise, proof that he could still decide where his labor ended. Sloane took the money. Her fingers brushed his for a second, cool, brief, undeniable. Later, inside his aging pickup, the engine groaned before surrendering to life. The cabin smelled of dust and old plastic. The wipers dragged across the windshield, pushing grime from one side to the other. It was a rhythm without destination, a movement that persisted simply because stopping would be worse. On the horizon, a pale stripe gathered between the factory chimneys. Not dawn-only fatigue made visible. Robert eased the clutch and drove toward his third job. No conclusions followed him. No relief waited ahead. There was only the gray light on the glass and the certainty of repetition. He endured, and in that endurance lay something almost like dignity. By the time the second shift ended, the sky had surrendered its last shade of gray and settled into something metallic and flat. The factory yard shimmered beneath floodlights that hummed with a tired insistence. Robert walked across the gravel with the slow precision of a man, measuring each step against invisible resistance. Around him, machines cooled reluctantly, ticking as though they resented the pause. Inside, the air was thick with iron filings and burnt oil. The presses stood in disciplined rows, silent now, yet charged with the memory of force. Robert often felt that the metal remembered more than the men who shaped it. Every beam, every sheet carried the imprint of hands, long gone hands that had bent, lifted, endured. A factory did not forget. It absorbed. In the locker room, he changed his shirt without looking at the others. Conversations there were brief and functional, like the exchange of tools. No one asked about plans. Plans implied deviation. Instead, there were remarks about hours, about overtime, about the way management shaved minutes from pay. It was arithmetic stripped of hope. Robert's locker door hung crooked on its hinge. Inside, folded with mechanical care, lay the second uniform for his third job. He touched the fabric as if confirming its reality. 3 shifts, 3 sets of fluorescent lights, 3 versions of himself. Yet the same fatigue threaded through them all, seamless and unbroken. He remembered his father standing in a similar room, unlacing boots with swollen fingers. As a child, Robert had believed factories were temporary structures men passed through on their way to something else. Now he understood. The buildings remained. It was the men who were provisional. Outside, a freight train moved along the far edge of the yard. Its cars clanked together with a hollow authority. Movement without change. Direction without choice. Robert watched it until the red lights dissolved into distance. For a second, he imagined stepping onto one of those cars, allowing himself to be carried elsewhere. The thought did not bloom. It withered quietly, as most thoughts did. He slid into his pickup again. The seat springs pressed against his back in familiar protest. On the dashboard lay the wrench from earlier, its surface dull under the streetlight. He picked it up, weighing it once more. The metal felt identical to the beams he had lifted all evening, unyielding, impartial. Secondary memory, he thought without naming it. The metal retained the shape of pressure long after the hands were gone. As he drove toward the warehouse where his third shift waited, the radio crackled with static. He did not adjust it. The noise was companion enough. The road stretched ahead, narrow and obedient. He followed it not out of faith, but because there was nowhere else to turn. The night deepened, and with it a strange steadiness. Exhaustion stripped life to essentials. Motion, breath, the next hour. He no longer asked whether this was living. He simply continued. Above the dark fields, the clouds hung low and swollen. They promised nothing. Robert pressed the accelerator gently. The engine answered with a weary tremor, as if it too understood that endurance was not courage. It was habit. The warehouse stood at the edge of town, where the asphalt gave up and turned to packed earth. Its walls were corrugated steel, dulled by years of wind that carried dust from the fields. Under the sodium lamps, everything looked jaundiced, as if the night itself were unwell. Robert parked beside a row of silent trucks and cut the engine. The sudden stillness felt heavier than the noise. Inside, the air smelled of cardboard, oil, and cold metal. Pallets were stacked with methodical indifference, labeled and numbered, destined for places no one here would ever see. The forklift waited near the loading bay like an obedient animal. When Robert turned the key, it answered with a low mechanical sigh. He moved through the aisles with practiced economy. Lift, reverse, pivot, lower. Each action precise, stripped of thought. The steel forks slid beneath crates, as if guided by memory rather than will. He sometimes imagined that the machine knew the choreography better than he did, that if he let go, it would continue without him. Around 2 a.m, the warehouse settled into its deepest quiet. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to hum more softly. Robert paused near a stack of sheet metal wrapped in plastic. He pressed his palm against it. The cold seeped through instantly, direct and unfiltered. Metal did not negotiate. It accepted pressure and returned nothing. He thought again of inheritance. Not land, not money, motion. The repetition of effort handed down like a surname. His father had once told him that work built character. Now Robert suspected it built only endurance, layer upon layer, until feeling dulled into function. A younger man named Eric crossed the floor pushing a pallet jack. He nodded at Robert, a small acknowledgement between strangers bound by the same hours. Eric's movements were quicker, not yet eroded. There was still impatience in him. Robert recognized it, the way one recognizes an old photograph proof of something that once existed. "Long night," Eric muttered. Robert nodded. Words felt unnecessary. Long nights were the structure of their lives, not an exception to it. When the first truck backed into the dock, its engine reverberated through the steel frame of the building. The vibration traveled up through Robert's boots, into his bones. For a moment, he felt indistinguishable from the structure around him, another beam-absorbing strain. Near dawn, fatigue sharpened instead of softened. The body, deprived of sleep, entered a narrow clarity. Every sound became exact. The scrape of pallet wood, the snap of plastic wrap, the muted thud of boxes meeting concrete. In that clarity, Robert understood something simple. The metal would outlast him. The warehouse would stand. The forklifts would be replaced. The men too. When his shift ended, he signed his name on the clipboard with a pen that skipped slightly on the page. The ink looked thin, uncertain. He placed the pen back in its chain and walked outside. The sky was turning pale again, a diluted gray spreading over the fields. Robert inhaled the morning air. It carried no promise, only coolness. He felt neither defeated nor hopeful, only aligned with the weight, with the rhythm, with the inherited gravity that pulled him forward. He started the truck once more. The engine answered with its habitual complaint. As he drove away, the warehouse receded into the light, already indistinct. Behind him, steel and concrete resumed their silent watch. Ahead, another day waited not as an opportunity, but as continuation. Sleep came to Robert in fragments, never whole. He returned to the small apartment after the third shift and closed the door softly, as if someone might be disturbed. No one was there. The rooms held the stale quiet of unattended spaces. The refrigerator hummed with a tired constancy, a sound too small to be called life, but too persistent to be ignored. He removed his father's coat and hung it carefully on the back of a chair. Without it, he felt lighter and more exposed, as if a layer of inherited armor had been stripped away. On the kitchen table lay unopened envelopes, arranged in a neat line. He did not sit. He did not open them. Paper could wait. It always did. He lowered himself onto the couch without unbracing. The fabric smelled faintly of detergent and old dust. When he closed his eyes, the warehouse returned immediately aisles of metal, the yellow glare of lamps, the precise geometry of crates. Even in rest, the mind continued to lift and carry. He dreamed not of people, but of machinery, belts turning without load, gears rotating against empty air. The absence of product made the motion seem almost ceremonial, a ritual performed long after its purpose had been forgotten. He woke with his jaw clenched and his hands curled as if gripping invisible handles. Afternoon light filtered weakly through the blinds. It divided the room into narrow bars of pale gray. For a moment he did not remember which shift awaited him next. The confusion was brief, then settled into recognition. The second job would begin in 3 hours. In the bathroom mirror, his face appeared flatter in daylight. The stubble on his jaw gave him an unfinished look. He ran water over his hands and watched it spiral down the drain. Even water, he thought, obeyed gravity without resistance. He opened the closet and stared at the uniforms hanging in a row. 3 sets, 3 colors, identical in wear. He chose one without hesitation. The act felt less like decision and more like compliance. Fabric against skin, buttons fastened. Another iteration assembled. Before leaving, he paused beside the table and finally picked up one envelope. He turned it over in his hands, but did not break the seal. The weight of it was negligible. The weight it represented was not. He placed it back exactly where it had been. Outside, the air had dried. The rain had retreated without leaving evidence. The town looked unchanged, as if the night's labor had never occurred. Robert locked the door and descended the narrow stairs. Somewhere in the distance, a factory siren marked the hour. He walked toward his truck with a steady, unhurried pace. Fatigue no longer felt dramatic. It was structural. He started the engine and listened to its uneven rhythm. There was comfort in that irregular pulse. It meant continuation. As he drove back toward the first shift of the new cycle, the sky remained colorless. Nothing in it suggested beginning or end, only extension. Robert adjusted the rear-view mirror once, not to look behind him, but to confirm that the road still existed. Then he kept driving. The second job occupied a low brick building beside the railroad tracks, a place that had once manufactured parts for tractors and now repaired what could no longer be replaced. The sign above the door was faded to the color of old bone. Inside, the air tasted of metal shavings and damp concrete. Robert tied on his apron and took his place at the workbench. The vise was scarred by decades of pressure. He fitted a bent axle into its jaws and tightened the handle until resistance met resistance. There was a clarity in repair work. Damage announced itself plainly. A crack could be welded. A bend could be forced back into line. Metal yielded if enough heat and insistence were applied. His supervisor, a thin man with nicotine-stained fingers, spoke rarely. Orders were left on a clipboard, reduced to part numbers and deadlines. No one asked why the equipment kept failing. No one questioned why it was cheaper to mend than to replace. In this town, replacement had become a luxury. As Robert guided the welding torch along a seam, sparks leapt outward in brief, violet arcs. For a second, the metal glowed orange, alive with possibility. Then it cooled, darkened, returned to its original indifference. He envied that simplicity. Metal remembered force, but it did not brood over it. Between tasks, he wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve. He thought of his father again, not as a figure, but as a posture, shoulders rounded, head slightly bowed, as if leaning into an invisible wind. The resemblance had become unavoidable. It was not genetics that disturbed him. It was trajectory. During a short break, he stepped outside to the narrow strip of gravel behind the shop. Freight cars passed slowly, their steel sides streaked with rust. He counted them without intention. 32, 33, motion without deviation. The tracks ran straight through town, indifferent to who boarded and who remained. He returned to his bench and resumed work. The axle, now straightened and reinforced, lay cooling beside him. It would re-enter circulation tomorrow, carrying weight it was never meant to bear twice. He ran his hand along its surface. The seam was visible if one knew where to look. The thought came quietly. Perhaps men were repaired the same way. Heated by circumstance, forced back into function, sent again into strain, the fracture never vanished. It only hardened. When the whistle blew to mark the end of the shift, Robert removed his apron and hung it on the same nail as always. The shop emptied in measured silence. Outside, evening had begun its descent, flattening color into shadow. He walked toward his truck with a steady gait. In his pocket, the old wrench pressed against his thigh. It had become less a tool and more a reminder. Secondary memory, he thought again. The metal retained every mark of pressure. And so did he. By the time Robert returned to the diner, the neon had resumed its uneven blinking, as faithful to failure as ever. The sky above Iowa was a low sheet of iron, pressing down without ceremony. Inside, The Blue Star held its familiar arrangement of chrome edges and worn vinyl, surfaces polished not by care but by repetition. He took the same seat at the counter. The stool gave a muted complaint beneath his weight. Sloane noticed him without looking surprised. In towns like this, surprise had long ago been exhausted. She poured coffee before he asked. The liquid trembled at the rim, dark and opaque, offering no reflection this time. Robert unfolded the envelope he had carried all afternoon. The paper split open with a small, decisive sound. Inside were numbers again adjusted, recalculated, extended. The language of extension was polite, almost generous. It spoke of options, of manageable plans. He read each line slowly, not searching for mercy, but for confirmation. Sloane wiped the counter in slow circles. "They don't make it easy," she said, not glancing at the page. "No," he answered. That was enough. Between them passed an understanding stripped of sympathy. They were not victims in each other's eyes, only participants. He folded the letter and slid it back into his pocket. The act felt neither rebellious nor submissive, merely procedural. Outside, headlights passed along the highway, streaks of white that did not pause for the diner's dim persistence. Robert watched the door as it opened for strangers who would leave within minutes. Truckers with temporary destinations, salesmen chasing minor quotas. They carried with them the illusion of elsewhere. He recognized it instantly and felt no desire for it. When he stepped outside for another cigarette, the rain had returned, lighter now, almost hesitant. The ember flared briefly against the damp air. Smoke rose and dissolved into the low clouds. He thought of his father standing in similar weather, collar turned up, hands deep in pockets. Not dramatic, not broken, simply present. A peculiar steadiness settled over him. The debt remained. The hours remained. The mechanism continued to turn. Yet within that motion, he sensed a narrow margin that still belonged to him, the choice to continue without illusion. He crushed the cigarette beneath his heel and re-entered the diner. Sloane glanced up once more. No words were exchanged. Words were unnecessary when repetition spoke clearly enough. Later, in the pickup, the engine shuddered awake as always. The wipers dragged across the windshield, smearing rain into broader shapes. Robert rested his hands on the steering wheel and looked straight ahead. The night did not promise change. It offered duration. He shifted into gear and pulled onto the road, the truck vibrating in quiet protest. Somewhere beyond the fields, factories waited with their steady hunger. Robert drove toward them without haste. Endurance, he had learned, was not loud. It moved forward in small increments, measured and exact, like the ticking of a clock that no longer expected to be heard. The third week of the month arrived without announcement. Time in Robert's life did not advance. It accumulated. Bills thickened in the drawer. Fatigue layered itself quietly over bone and nerve. Even the weather seemed to repeat with minor variations. Rain, then dry wind, then rain again, as if the sky too had surrendered to routine. At the warehouse, a machine failed near midnight. A conveyor belt seized with a metallic shriek that sliced through the fluorescent hum. Boxes tilted, one falling open on the concrete. Its contents, small, identical metal brackets, spilled outward in a dull cascade. The sound was not dramatic, it was final. Robert crouched beside the machine with a wrench in hand. He examined the stripped gear, its teeth worn thin from friction. The failure was not sudden. It had been rehearsing for months. He replaced the part with a practiced economy, his movements steady, almost gentle. When he restarted the belt, it resumed its motion without gratitude. Eric watched from a distance. "You ever think of leaving?" he asked, half smiling, as though the idea were a rumor. Robert tightened the last bolt and wiped his hands on a rag. "Leaving what?" he replied. Eric shrugged. The question collapsed under its own weight. There was no clear border to cross, no defined exit. The town was not a cage. It was a gravity field. Later, during a brief pause, Robert found himself staring at his reflection in the polished steel of a loading bay door. The image was warped, elongated. He barely recognized it. The face seemed older than the body it occupied, as though the future had arrived early and taken residence. He thought of the $5 bill he had left on the diner counter days before. A small gesture, almost invisible. Yet it had been deliberate. In a life governed by inherited momentum, that act had been a deviation minor, but real. As dawn approached, a pale wash of light seeped through the high windows. The warehouse shifted from yellow to gray. The men moved more slowly now, their steps dragging across the concrete. Fatigue did not shout. It pressed inward, steady and patient. When the shift ended, Robert did not leave immediately. He stood for a moment beside the silent conveyor belt, resting his palm on its cold frame. The metal held the memory of motion, of strain, of interruption. It would continue long after he was gone. Outside, the horizon carried a thin silver line, neither hopeful nor bleak. Simply present. Robert inhaled the cool air and felt the familiar pull toward the next obligation. He understood then that escape was not a doorway, but an absence of weight. And weight, in his world, was structural. He walked to his truck and started the engine. The familiar vibration traveled through the steering wheel into his hands. He did not accelerate immediately. For a brief second, the truck idled in place, suspended between motion and stillness. It was a small interval, almost imperceptible. Then he eased his foot onto the gas and merged back onto the road, carrying with him the quiet knowledge that endurance itself could become a form of will. The weeks settled into each other without edges. Robert stopped distinguishing Mondays from Thursdays. The shifts arranged themselves like identical beams in a frame load-bearing, interchangeable. Even his thoughts began to move in loops, returning to the same junctions without resolution. One evening, after the second job, he drove past the old house where he had grown up. It stood at the end of a narrow street, its siding peeled by wind and years. No lights burned inside. The yard was uneven, grass surrendered to weeds. He did not slow down at first. Then he did. The truck idled at the curb. The engine's tremor felt louder in the stillness. Robert watched the dark windows, half expecting movement. Nothing shifted. The house seemed less abandoned than paused, as though waiting for occupants who would never return. He stepped out and approached the porch. The wood sagged slightly under his weight. He did not have a key. He did not need one. The door had long ago been forced and replaced. Through a narrow crack in the curtain, he could see the outline of the living room empty, except for a single chair left against the wall. He remembered that chair. His father had sat in it after shifts, coat still on, boots unlaced but not removed. Silence had filled the room the way furniture once had. As a boy, Robert had believed silence meant peace. Later, he understood it was accumulation words unsaid, chances deferred. He placed his hand on the porch railing. The wood was damp and splintered. Beneath his palm, it held years of pressure and weather. Secondary memory lived here too, embedded in grain and rusted nails. For a moment, he imagined entering the house, claiming it, repainting the walls, replacing the broken panes. A thought arrived fully formed and dissolved just as quickly. Restoration required surplus. He lived in deficit. A car passed at the end of the street, its headlights sweeping briefly across him. In that stark light, the house appeared smaller than he remembered. Not tragic, merely finite. Robert returned to the truck and sat without starting it. The dashboard clock glowed faintly. He studied the numbers, aware that each minute carried both cost and continuation. The debt extended behind him, but the road ahead was no clearer. Finally, he turned the key. The engine responded with its habitual complaint. He shifted into gear and pulled away from the curb. In the rear-view mirror, the house receded into shadow, indistinguishable from the others. As he drove toward the warehouse, the fields lay flat under a thin crescent moon. The land held its own silence, vast and indifferent. Robert felt no surge of rebellion, no dramatic break, only a deeper recognition. Inheritance was not a single event, but a climate. He pressed the accelerator slightly harder than usual. The truck answered, not with power, but with persistence. And for now, persistence was enough. By the end of the month, the body began to negotiate with itself. Robert noticed it first in his hands. A faint tremor remained even when he was still, not dramatic, not disabling, simply present, like a small defect in steel that one learns to ignore. At the diner, the neon finally surrendered a letter entirely. The sign now read blue_tar. No one mentioned it. The absence felt appropriate. Inside, the coffee tasted thinner, or perhaps his tongue had grown indifferent. He unfolded the bank notice again, though he already knew its contents. The numbers had advanced with patient discipline. There was a proposal now, an adjusted schedule, extended years. Time stretched like wire pulled tight between two posts. Sloane set the cup before him and rested her hands briefly on the counter. "You look worse," she said quietly. "Maybe I'm just more visible," he replied. She gave a short nod, neither amused nor concerned. Visibility in this town did not equate to recognition. It meant only that the wear had surfaced. Later, at the warehouse, he misjudged the angle of a pallet. The crate tipped, striking his shoulder before hitting the ground. Pain flared clean and immediate. For a second, the world narrowed to a single sharp axis. Eric rushed forward, asking if he was all right. Robert straightened slowly. "It's fine," he said, though the word felt imprecise. The bruise bloomed beneath his shirt as the hours passed. Each movement reminded him that metal could bruise flesh, but flesh left no mark in return. The imbalance was absolute. During the final break before dawn, he stood alone near the loading dock. The air carried the smell of diesel and wet earth. He flexed his shoulder and felt the resistance there, the small rebellion of muscle against strain. For the first time in months, he allowed a thought to remain uncorrected. The mechanism did not care if he stopped. The shifts would be filled. The belts would turn. The debt would persist in different hands. The realization did not terrify him. It steadied him. When the shift ended, he did not hurry to the truck. He watched the pale line of morning gather above the fields. The silver light did not promise renewal. It exposed surfaces without mercy. He touched the wrench in his pocket and then removed it, weighing it in his palm. The metal was cool, unchanged. He set it down on the dock beside him and left it there. It was a small gesture, almost meaningless. Yet as he walked toward the truck, he felt the absence in his pocket distinctly. The engine started with its familiar shudder. He drove forward into the thinning darkness, carrying the bruise in his shoulder in the empty space at his side. Nothing had ended. Nothing had begun. But something had shifted quietly, like a gear disengaging without announcement. Storm without rain. The asphalt outside the Blue Star Motel held the heat like a grudge. Nothing moved except the thin shimmer above the road and the ceiling fan inside room 7, turning with a dry, obedient squeak. It kept the same rhythm, as if time still trusted machines more than men. Kane arrived without a suitcase. He carried only a crushed Hamilton watch in the pocket of his shirt. The glass was split like frozen water, the hands arrested between two meaningless minutes. He placed it on the knitstand with the caution one reserves for the dead. The second hand did not tremble. It did not even pretend. Dust lay on the windowsill in a patient layer. Beyond the glass stood a closed factory chimney, thin and black against the white sky. The town had once depended on schedules trains arriving, whistles blowing, lunch breaks measured in sharp metallic certainty. Now the air pressed down without urgency. It was hot and indifferent. Kane sat on the bed and unbuttoned his cuffs. His wrist bore a pale band of skin where the watch had ruled him for 30 years. He touched it absently. The flesh felt lighter without the weight, but also unfinished, like a scar that refused to close. For most of his life, he had spoken in numbers. Departure times, switching orders, corrected delays. He had believed that if the lines on paper were straight enough, the world would obey them. The accident had not been loud in his memory. What remained was not the sound of steel, but the silence after it, when even the ticking in his head stopped asking for correction. He lay back without removing his shoes. The mattress exhaled a tired sigh. Somewhere in the distance, a freight train passed, its low thunder rolling across the flat land. Kane did not reach for the watch. He did not calculate. He let the sound move through him like wind through a broken fence. The fan continued its rotation. The road outside remained empty. For the first time in decades, Kane did not feel late. Morning arrived without color. The light over the highway was pale and undecided, as if it had forgotten its purpose on the way in. The Blue Star Diner smelled of burnt toast, old grease, and coffee that had been waiting longer than anyone cared to admit. Marta stood behind the counter with the steady patience of someone who no longer expects surprise. She poured coffee into Kane's cup without asking. The liquid was dark and thin. It steamed briefly, then surrendered. Her eyes moved to his wrist. The pale strip of skin was visible where the watch should have rested. She did not comment on it. Instead, she spoke about the weather, about how the cornfields had dried too early this year, about fuel prices climbing like stubborn weeds. Kane nodded at the appropriate moments. Their words touched the surface of things and sank no deeper. He placed a cigarette between his lips and searched his pockets. The lighter sparked once, weakly, then died. He tried again. Nothing. The cigarette remained unlit, hanging there like a decision postponed. Marta slid a box of matches across the counter, but he did not take it. After a moment, he removed the cigarette and set it beside the cup. "You passing through?" she asked. "No," Kane replied. It was the only word he needed. Outside, a truck rumbled past without slowing. The diner windows rattled faintly. Marta wiped an already clean section of the counter. They both understood the same thing without naming it. There are places one passes through and places one simply ends up in. Kane lifted the cup and drank. The coffee was bitter and familiar. He felt no hurry to finish it. The silence of the morning broke with the violent cough of an engine that refused dignity. A rusted sedan swung into the gravel lot, throwing up a cloud of dust that rose and lingered as if uncertain whether to settle again. Miller stepped out with the restless energy of someone who still believed in destinations. He wore sunglasses too large for his narrow face and spoke before the diner door had fully closed behind him. Which way to California? He asked no one in particular, then laughed as though the question itself were proof of movement. Marta poured him coffee. He drank it too fast, burning his tongue and pretending not to notice. His words came in burst jobs waiting, cities shining, highways that led somewhere better. He spoke of opportunity as if it were a train already whistling in the distance. Kane watched him without expression. The young man's impatience moved like a small storm contained inside thin bones. It was familiar. Once, Kane had trusted timetables the way Miller trusted maps. "My watch broke," Miller said suddenly, noticing the crushed Hamilton resting near Kane's plate. "There's a shop in town. I could take it in, get it running again." Kane turned the watch slowly in his fingers. The fractured glass caught the light but gave nothing back. "It tells the right time twice a day," he said. "That's enough?" Miller frowned, unsure whether it was a joke. Outside, the dust began to settle back onto the gravel, covering the tire tracks as if the car had never arrived at all. Night returned without ceremony. The highway dimmed to a thin gray ribbon and the factory chimney dissolved into shadow. In room 7, the ceiling fan turned with its faithful complaint, stirring warm air that carried no relief. Kane lay awake, fully dressed. Sleep had become something other men possessed. He heard it before he realized he was listening, the distant tremor of a freight train crossing the flat land beyond town. The sound came low and patient, like memory moving on iron. His hand moved automatically toward the knitstand. For years, that gesture had meant verification, checking the schedule, confirming the minute, correcting the deviation before it could grow teeth. His fingers touched the watch instead. The glass was cold and uneven beneath his skin. He closed his eyes. He did not remember the crash as noise. Others had described it later: metal folding, brakes screaming, radios shouting over each other. In his mind, there was only the silence after, the unnatural pause when the line no longer belonged to time. He had corrected a number by habit, not doubt. 1 minute misplaced, one train released too soon. The train outside continued past the town, its wheels beating a steady rhythm that no longer concerned him. Kane did not count the seconds between axles. He did not calculate distance. When the sound faded, the silence returned thicker than before. He left the watch where it was and folded his hands over his chest. The fan turned. The dark remained. For the first time, he allowed the line to run without him. The trouble announced itself with a hollow cough beneath the floorboards. The water in the diner sink shuddered, then thinned to a weak thread before disappearing altogether. Marta turned the faucet once more, as if insistence might restore order. It did not. Customers were few, but even they paused, startled by the absence of something so ordinary. The air grew heavier without the quiet reassurance of running water. Kane stood slowly from his seat. He did not volunteer. He simply moved. Marta handed him a wrench without speaking, as if the gesture had been rehearsed in another life. Together they stepped outside to the small shed where the pump crouched like a tired animal. The metal casing was warm from the sun. Kane knelt, opened it, and stared into the dim cavity of pipes and bolts. The problem was simple: something clogged, something worn. It always was. He worked without urgency. His hands moved by memory, not ambition. Oil smeared across his fingers and into the lines of his skin. It darkened his palms and refused to leave when he wiped them against his trousers. Marta watched from the doorway. There was no admiration in her gaze, only recognition. This was the only language Kane still spoke: pressure, friction, release. Not to fix the world, just to quiet a small malfunction. When the pump finally coughed back to life, the sound was modest. Water returned inside the diner with a thin, obedient rush. Kane rose and wiped his hands again, though the oil remained. It would remain for a long time. Late afternoon sagged into a dull copper light when Miller reappeared on the highway. This time there was no engine, no cloud of triumphant dust. He walked with the stubborn gait of someone arguing with the ground. His car had died 5 miles out. The promise of California now sat tilted on the shoulder of the road, hood open like a mouth that refused to speak. Sweat darkened his shirt. The sunglasses were gone. He pushed through the diner door without greeting. Marta poured him water instead of coffee. He drank it slowly, as if the act required discipline. "It just stopped," he said. "Like that," Kane nodded. Machines did not need drama to fail. Miller's eyes fell on the crushed Hamilton lying near Kane's elbow. He picked it up carefully, studying the fractured glass as though it concealed value. "That's vintage," he said. "Could get something for it? I know a guy who buys old pieces. Fixes them. Makes them worth more." Kane watched the young man's reflection splintered across the broken dial. "It already is what it's worth," he replied. Miller turned the watch in his palm, imagining its resurrection. Kane saw in him the same hunger that once drove trains through night and storm, the belief that if something moved, it mattered. Kane reached beneath the counter, and poured a small measure of whiskey into a chipped glass. He slid it toward Miller without comment. The young man hesitated, then drank. Outside, the stalled highway waited in silence. Toward evening, the sky darkened with theatrical intention. Clouds gathered above the highway, thick and bruised, promising relief they did not intend to deliver. The wind rose first dry, insistent pushing dust across the gravel lot in restless spirals. Marta locked the diner door, though no one was trying to enter. The three of them remained inside, suspended in the charged air. The neon sign outside flickered once, then surrendered to darkness. Dust pressed against the windows like a crowd without faces. The lights trembled and went out. For a moment, the diner existed only as shape and memory. Marta found an old lighter in her apron pocket and struck it. The flame trembled but held. Kane lit a candle from the counter. Miller watched as if witnessing some minor ceremony. Marta pulled a small radio from beneath the counter and turned the dial. Static filled the room-thin voices of distant stations that refused to form words. She lowered the volume. "I meant to leave once," she said into the dimness. Had a map, marked a city with a red circle. She paused. Forgot which one. The wind pressed harder against the walls. Kane sat with his hands folded, listening not to the storm, but to its restraint. There would be no rain. "I used to know exactly where everything was going," he said quietly. Down to the minute. Miller shifted in his chair, restless even in darkness. Outside, the storm spent itself in dust and nothing more. Inside, the small flame continued to burn unambitious, sufficient. The wind eased by morning, leaving the highway coated in a thin gray film. The world looked handled, as if someone had tried to erase it and grown tired halfway through. Miller moved differently now. The sharp edges of his certainty had dulled overnight. He stood near the counter, turning the crushed Hamilton in his hands when he thought no one was watching. The fractured glass caught the early light in quiet splinters. Kane saw him. He said nothing. Marta stepped into the back room. The door swung once and settled. In that small interval of privacy, Miller slipped the watch into his jacket pocket. The gesture was quick, almost apologetic. He did not look at Kane. He left through the side door, moving fast at first, then breaking into a run across the dust-coated lot. His figure thinned against the empty road, shrinking toward the stalled promise of distance. Kane remained seated. He did not call out. He did not rise. There was no surge of anger, no tightening in his chest. Only a strange lightness where habit had once pressed. The pale band on his wrist seemed to fade under the sun. The watch had measured his obedience for decades. It had tightened around him like a quiet command. Now it was gone, carried away by someone who still believed in repair. Kane stepped outside and watched Miller's outline dissolve into heat and dust. Something inside him released small metallic final. The last spring had unwound. An hour passed without event. The highway lay exposed under a pale sky that offered neither threat nor mercy. Kane walked without direction, his steps guided less by purpose than by the simple act of moving. The dust still carried the imprint of Miller's hurried departure. A faint trail cut through the gray surface toward the bend, where the road dipped and disappeared. Kane followed it. He found the watch near a shallow ditch, half buried in powdery earth. It lay on its side, like a small animal that had tried to crawl and failed. The strap was torn loose. The glass, already cracked, had surrendered completely. Fragments clung to the dial in dull, uneven teeth. Kane crouched and lifted it carefully. It weighed less than he remembered. There was no note, no explanation. Miller had understood what the mechanism was worth. A broken engine cannot be persuaded by optimism. It obeys only its own exhaustion. Kane brushed the dust from the face with his thumb. The hands remained fixed, pointing nowhere that mattered. He held it in his palm, not as property, but as something finished. A truck passed in the distance, indifferent. Kane stood and began walking back toward the motel. He carried the watch loosely, as one carries a bird that has already stopped struggling. The sun descended behind the abandoned factory chimney, turning it into a thin black cut against a fading sky. The heat softened. The dust settled into its habitual stillness. Nothing demanded to be done. Kane sat on the veranda of the Blue Star, the broken watch resting beside him on the wooden railing. He no longer kept it in his pocket. It lay exposed, its ruined dial catching the last light without reflection. Marta stepped outside with 2 cigarettes. She handed one to him and lit both with the same steady flame. They did not speak. The smoke drifted upward and disappeared before reaching any visible height. Across the highway, the world remained unfinished fields thinning into scrub, telephone poles leaning slightly as if tired of holding their lines. No train passed. No engine roared to interrupt the evening. Kane picked up the watch once more, feeling the loose parts shift faintly inside the casing. There was no impulse to repair it, no thought of selling it, no need to assign it meaning. He placed it back on the railing. A small gust of wind brushed across the veranda. Dust slid gently over the cracked tile, softening its edges. Kane did not wipe it away. Marta exhaled and looked toward the horizon. Kane followed her gaze. There was no sign that tomorrow would improve itself. No signal, no whistle, no schedule waiting to be corrected. The light faded. The silence held. For the first time in his life, Kane allowed it to be enough.